Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. As you settle into your quiet space tonight, let yourself sink deeper into the world of police reports and archived memories. Tonight we explore the careful language of documentation, the way officers translated chaos into order through the patient act of writing. The reports began arriving at Central Records each morning in manila envelopes, their contents typed on the standard forms that had been in use since 1983. Each report followed the same basic structure. But within that framework, individual officers developed their own rhythms of documentation, their own ways of transforming the raw complexity of human behavior into the ordered language that the department required. Sergeant Williams had always been particularly meticulous in his reporting, a trait that became apparent to anyone who spent time reading through his case files. His reports from the winter of 1988 demonstrated a level of detail that went beyond mere compliance with departmental standards, revealing an officer who understood that these documents would serve as the primary record of events that had disrupted the normal flow of community life. On February 14, 1988, Sergeant Williams had responded to a report of vandalism at Lincoln Elementary School. Someone had broken several windows and scattered papers throughout 2 classrooms, creating what the principal described as a scene of senseless destruction. Sergeant Williams's initial report, filed later that same day, began with the standard heading information, case number 880247, and proceeded to document every detail of the scene with careful precision. The broken windows, he noted, were located on the north side of the building, facing the playground rather than the street. Glass fragments had been found both inside and outside the classrooms, suggesting that the windows had been broken from the exterior. The pattern of glass distribution indicated that multiple impacts had been necessary to fully shatter each window, implying either the use of small projectiles or repeated strikes with a blunt instrument. Inside the classrooms, papers had been removed from desks and filing cabinets and scattered across the floor in what appeared to be a random pattern. However, Sergeant Williams had noted that closer examination revealed certain consistencies in the distribution. Student work had been separated from administrative documents, and personal items belonging to the teachers had been left untouched on their desks. The report continued with detailed descriptions of each affected area, measurements of the classrooms, and an inventory of damaged materials. Sergeant Williams had photographed the scene from multiple angles, and his written descriptions referenced these photographs with the precision of someone who understood that others would need to reconstruct the events based solely on his documentation. What made Sergeant Williams's report particularly notable was the attention he paid to details that might not have seemed immediately relevant to the investigation. He noted that the custodial supplies had been undisturbed, despite being easily accessible in an unlocked closet. He documented the exact position of chairs and desks, observing that they had been moved but not damaged, suggesting that the perpetrator had been careful to avoid creating unnecessary obstacles while moving through the rooms. The report included interviews with school personnel who had discovered the damage, conducted with the same methodical approach that characterized Sergeant Williams's documentation of the physical evidence. Principal Martinez had arrived at school early that morning to prepare for a scheduled meeting with parents, discovering the broken windows and immediately calling police before entering the building. Mrs. Thompson, a third-grade teacher whose classroom had been affected, described her reaction upon seeing her carefully organized lesson plans scattered across the floor. Sergeant Williams had recorded not just the factual content of her statement, but also her emotional response to the violation of her professional space. Understanding that these human details were as important as the physical evidence in creating a complete record of the incident, the janitor, Mr. Peterson, had provided information about the building's security procedures and his observations from the previous evening when he had locked the school. Everything had been normal when he left at 6:30 p.m., with all windows intact and all doors properly secured. His keys remained in his possession throughout the night, and there were no signs that any of the building's locks had been tampered with. Sergeant Williams had spent considerable time documenting the school's physical layout and security features, creating a written map that could be referenced by other investigators or used in court proceedings if necessary. He noted the location of each entrance, the type of locks used, the positioning of exterior lighting, and the sight lines from nearby streets and buildings. The investigation had proceeded methodically over the following weeks, with Sergeant Williams filing supplemental reports that tracked each development in the case. He had interviewed neighbors whose homes overlooked the school grounds, documenting their observations about unusual activity in the area during the previous week. Mrs. Patterson, who lived directly across from the school, had noticed a group of teenagers gathering near the playground after dark on several occasions. Though she had not observed any obviously suspicious behavior, the breakthrough in the case had come through what Sergeant Williams described as patient observation rather than dramatic detective work. He had begun spending time in the area during evening hours, not conducting active surveillance, but simply familiarizing himself with the normal patterns of activity around the school. During one of these informal patrols, he had noticed that the broken windows were visible from a specific position on the playground equipment, suggesting that the vandalism might have been the result of target practice rather than malicious destruction. This observation had led him to search the playground area more thoroughly, eventually discovering several small rocks that had been gathered and placed in a pile near the swing set. The rocks were of uniform size and weight, the type that would be ideal for throwing at targets. More importantly, their positioning suggested that they had been collected deliberately rather than scattered randomly by wind or other natural forces. Sergeant Williams had documented this discovery with the same careful attention he had applied to every other aspect of the case, measuring the distance from the rock pile to the broken windows, noting the trajectory that projectiles would need to follow, and photographing the evidence in its original position before collecting it for further analysis. Case had been solved when several students at the school had come forward with information about classmates who had been using the playground as a gathering place after hours. The vandalism had not been motivated by anger or malicious intent, but had resulted from what one of the students described as a game that had gotten out of hand. The teenagers had been competing to see who could hit specific targets with thrown rocks, with the school windows becoming increasingly tempting objectives as their accuracy improved. Sergeant Williams's final report on the case had included detailed documentation of the resolution process, describing how the responsible students had been identified through careful interviews with their peers, and how the matter had been handled through cooperation between the police department, the school administration, and the families involved. The students had been required to pay for the window repairs and to perform community service at the school, but the approach had been educational rather than purely punitive. The file contained letters from several parents expressing their appreciation for Sergeant Williams's thorough but sensitive handling of the case. One mother had written to thank him for taking the time to explain the legal implications of vandalism to her son, helping the teenager understand the broader consequences of what he had initially viewed as harmless fun. These kinds of detailed reports formed the backbone of the department's documentation system, creating a comprehensive record that could be referenced years later by other officers working on similar cases or by researchers trying to understand patterns of crime and community response. Sergeant Williams's meticulous approach ensured that future readers would be able to understand not just what had happened, but how the investigation had proceeded and why particular decisions had been made. The reports from this period reflected a time when officers had the luxury of thorough documentation, when the pace of police work allowed for the kind of careful attention to detail that characterized Sergeant Williams's files. Each report was typed on the standard forms using manual typewriters that required officers to consider their words carefully. Since corrections were difficult and time-consuming to make, Detective Morrison's reports from the same period demonstrated a different but equally careful approach to documentation. Her files from the spring of 1988 dealt primarily with domestic disputes, cases that required particular sensitivity in their documentation because of the complex family dynamics involved and the potential for situations to escalate if not handled properly. On March 22, 1988, Detective Morrison had responded to a domestic disturbance call at 1247 Oak Street, where neighbors had reported loud arguing and what sounded like furniture being thrown. Her initial report documented her arrival at the scene, noting that the arguing had stopped by the time she reached the front door, but that she could hear quiet crying from inside the house. The report described Detective Morrison's careful approach to gaining entry to the home, her use of established protocols for domestic disturbance calls, and her initial assessment of the situation she encountered inside. Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez were both present, along with their 2 young children, ages 4 and 7. Mrs. Rodriguez showed signs of having been crying, while Mr. Rodriguez appeared agitated but cooperative with Detective Morrison's questions. Detective Morrison's documentation of her interviews with the family members revealed the careful balance required in domestic dispute cases, where officers needed to gather accurate information while also ensuring the safety of all parties involved. She had spoken with each adult separately, allowing them to describe their perspectives on the argument without the immediate pressure of confrontation with their spouse. Mrs. Rodriguez had explained that the argument had been about money, specifically about Mr. Rodriguez's decision to purchase an expensive tool set for his work without discussing it with her first. The purchase had been made using money that she had been saving for their daughter's birthday party, and the discovery had led to an escalating argument about financial responsibility and communication within the marriage. Mr. Rodriguez had acknowledged making the purchase without consultation, but had explained that the tools were necessary for a new job opportunity that could significantly increase his income. He had intended to replace the money before his wife discovered it was missing, but she had found the receipt before he had been able to explain the situation properly. Detective Morrison's report noted that both parties had expressed love and concern for each other despite their anger about the immediate conflict. Neither had made allegations of physical violence, and her observation of the scene confirmed that the noise neighbors had reported was likely the result of Mr. Rodriguez throwing work clothes and tools into a bag during the argument, rather than any aggressive behavior toward his wife. The children had been frightened by the arguing, but showed no signs of physical harm or chronic fear of their parents. Detective Morrison had spoken with them briefly, using age-appropriate language to assess their understanding of the situation and to provide reassurance about their safety. Her report documented the resolution process that had evolved during her visit, as the couple had gradually moved from defensive positions to more productive communication about their underlying concerns. Detective Morrison had served primarily as a mediator, helping each person articulate their concerns and understand their spouse's perspective. The case had been closed without any formal charges, but Detective Morrison's report included recommendations for follow-up resources that might help the family develop better communication strategies and financial planning skills. She had provided information about counseling services available through the community center, and had suggested that the couple might benefit from meeting with a financial advisor who could help them establish better systems for managing their household budget. Detective Morrison's approach to domestic disputes reflected an understanding that police intervention in family conflicts was often most effective when it focused on immediate safety concerns, while also addressing the underlying issues that created ongoing tension. Her reports documented not just the immediate incidents that prompted police calls, but also the broader family dynamics that needed to be considered in developing appropriate responses. The file contained a follow-up report filed 6 months later, noting that Detective Morrison had made periodic check-ins with the Rodriguez family as part of her community policing responsibilities. The family had enrolled in financial counseling and had reported significant improvement in their communication about money and other household decisions. Mr. Rodriguez's new job had indeed provided increased income, and they had been able to establish an emergency fund that reduced the financial stress that had contributed to their earlier conflicts. These domestic dispute cases required particularly careful documentation because of their potential for escalation and their impact on children and other family members. Detective Morrison's reports demonstrated the importance of understanding these incidents within their full social and economic context, rather than simply responding to their immediate symptoms. Another case from Detective Morrison's files involved the Johnson family, where an elderly father was experiencing conflicts with his adult son who had moved back home after a divorce. The initial report, filed in April 1988, documented a situation where generational differences and economic stress had created a volatile living situation that was affecting the entire neighborhood. Mr. Johnson Sr., age 73, had called police after an argument with his 45-year-old son had escalated to the point where the younger man had thrown a coffee mug against the kitchen wall. Detective Morrison's report noted that both men had been drinking, which had contributed to the intensity of their argument, but that neither had made threats of physical violence against the other. The argument had been about Mr. Johnson Jr.'s contribution to household expenses and his responsibility for maintaining the property where he was now living rent-free. The elder Mr. Johnson had expected his son to help with yard work and minor repairs in exchange for room and board, while the younger man had felt that his father was treating him like an unpaid laborer rather than recognizing his temporary financial difficulties. Detective Morrison's interviews with both men had revealed deeper issues about independence, respect, and the challenges of adult children returning to live with their parents. During times of personal crisis, Mr. Johnson Jr. had been struggling with depression following his divorce and had been finding it difficult to motivate himself for job searching or household responsibilities. Mr. Johnson Sr. had been dealing with his own adjustments to aging, including the recent loss of his wife and his increasing need for assistance with tasks that he had always handled independently. Having his son in the house provided practical help and companionship, but it also created new sources of stress and conflict. Detective Morrison's report documented her efforts to help both men understand each other's perspectives and to develop practical solutions for their living arrangement. She had suggested establishing clear expectations and boundaries that would allow them to coexist peacefully while Mr. Johnson Jr. worked on rebuilding his independent life. The resolution had involved creating what Detective Morrison described as a household contract, similar to the approach used by Officer Chun in the Morrison case from the previous year's files. The agreement specified Mr. Johnson Jr.'s responsibilities for household tasks and his timeline for finding employment and alternative housing, while also acknowledging his father's need for companionship and assistance during his own period of adjustment. Detective Morrison's follow-up reports traced the gradual improvement in the father-son relationship over the following months. Mr. Johnson Jr. had found employment at a local hardware store and had begun contributing to household expenses while also taking over many of the maintenance tasks that his father was no longer able to handle safely. The case file included a letter from Mr. Johnson Sr., written several months after the initial incident, thanking Detective Morrison for her patience and understanding during what he described as one of the most difficult periods of his life. He reported that having clear expectations and regular communication had transformed his relationship with his son from a source of constant conflict to one of mutual support and respect. These domestic dispute cases highlighted the complex social and economic factors that often contributed to family conflicts, and Detective Morrison's careful documentation provided valuable insights into effective approaches for addressing these underlying issues. Her reports demonstrated that successful police intervention in family matters required skills that went well beyond traditional law enforcement training. The spring of 1988 had also brought a series of reports from Officer Washington, who specialized in juvenile cases and had developed particular expertise in working with teenagers who were experiencing conflicts with authority figures. His files from this period documented several cases that illustrated the careful balance required when police intervention involved minors and their families. One particularly detailed case involved 15-year-old Sarah Chun, no relation to Detective Sarah Chun from the archives, who had been caught shoplifting makeup from the local drugstore. Officer Washington's initial report noted that Sarah had been cooperative during her arrest, but had seemed more embarrassed than defiant about her actions. Officer Washington's report included detailed documentation of his conversations with Sarah about the consequences of shoplifting, both legal and personal. He had explained how a criminal record could affect her future educational and employment opportunities, and had helped her understand that the temporary social benefits she hoped to gain were far outweighed by the potential long-term costs of her actions. More importantly, Officer Washington had worked with Sarah and her parents to address the underlying social pressures that had motivated the shoplifting. His report documented referrals to school counselors who could help Sarah develop better strategies for dealing with peer pressure, and suggestions for family activities that could help build her self-confidence without requiring expensive purchases. The case had been resolved through a diversion program that allowed Sarah to avoid formal charges while still learning from her mistake. She had been required to write a letter of apology to the store manager, to perform community service at a local youth center, and to attend several sessions with a counselor who specialized in adolescent development and decision-making. Officer Washington's follow-up reports tracked Sarah's progress through the diversion program and her improved relationships both at home and at school. The counseling sessions had helped her develop better communication skills and more realistic perspectives about social relationships, while the community service had provided opportunities to build genuine friendships with peers who shared her interests and values. The file contained a letter from Sarah herself, written 6 months after the shoplifting incident, thanking Officer Washington for his kindness and understanding during what she described as one of the most frightening experiences of her young life. She reported that the incident had actually led to positive changes in her relationship with her parents and had helped her recognize the difference between genuine friendship and superficial social acceptance. These juvenile cases required particularly careful documentation because of the potential long-term impact of police intervention on young people's development and future opportunities. Officer Washington's reports demonstrated the importance of understanding teenage behavior within its developmental and social context rather than simply applying adult standards of legal responsibility. Another case from Officer Washington's files involved a group of teenagers who had been gathering in the parking lot of an abandoned shopping center, creating concerns among nearby residents about noise, litter, and potential criminal activity. His initial reports documented the complexity of addressing youth behavior that was not clearly illegal but was causing community tension. The teenagers, ranging in age from 14 to 17, had been using the parking lot as an informal meeting place where they could gather away from adult supervision. Most of their activities were harmless socializing, but the large groups and late hours had made some neighbors nervous, and there had been occasional incidents involving loud music, minor vandalism, and confrontations with adults who asked them to leave. Officer Washington's approach to this situation had been to engage with the teenagers directly rather than simply responding to complaints from adults. His reports documented multiple visits to the parking lot during evening hours, when he would talk with the young people about their activities and try to understand why they had chosen this particular location for their gatherings. Conversations revealed that the teenagers had few alternative spaces where they could socialize freely without constant adult oversight. The local youth center closed early in the evening, and many of their homes were not suitable for large group gatherings because of space limitations or family circumstances. The abandoned parking lot had provided what they saw as an ideal compromise, a place where they could be together without bothering anyone else. Officer Washington's reports noted that most of the teenagers were well-behaved and respectful during his visits, and that the problematic incidents had been caused by a small subset of the group rather than representing the behavior of all participants. However, he also documented the legitimate concerns of neighborhood residents who worried about liability issues, property damage, and the precedent of allowing unsupervised teenage gatherings in a location that was not designed for such activities. The solution that emerged from Officer Washington's patient mediation was more creative than anyone had initially anticipated. He had worked with the teenagers, neighborhood residents, and local business leaders to identify alternative spaces that could accommodate the young people's need for social gathering while addressing adult concerns about supervision and accountability. The local community center had agreed to extend its evening hours on weekends, providing a supervised space where teenagers could gather for social activities. Several local businesses had offered part-time employment opportunities that would give the young people constructive ways to spend their time while also earning money for activities and purchases. Most importantly, Officer Washington had facilitated the creation of a youth advisory committee that included both teenagers and adults, providing an ongoing forum for addressing conflicts and developing new programs that met the needs of young people while maintaining community standards. His final reports on this case documented the gradual transition of teenage social activities from the abandoned parking lot to the expanded community center programs. The neighborhood complaints had ended, but more significantly, several of the teenagers had become actively involved in community service projects and leadership development programs that grew out of the Youth Advisory Committee. These cases illustrated the complex challenges involved in maintaining community order while also supporting the healthy development of young people. Officer Washington's careful documentation provided valuable insights into effective approaches for addressing youth-related conflicts that recognize the legitimate needs and perspectives of all community members. The reports from 1988 also included extensive documentation of property crime investigations, cases that required meticulous attention to physical evidence and witness testimony. Detective Brown's files from this period demonstrated the methodical approach that characterized successful investigations of burglary, theft, and vandalism cases. One particularly comprehensive case involved a series of break-ins at local businesses that had occurred over a 6-week period during the summer of 1988. Detective Brown's initial reports documented each incident with careful attention to the methods used by the perpetrator, the types of items stolen, and the physical evidence left at each scene. The first break-in had occurred at Morrison Hardware, where someone had entered through a rear window after cutting the screen and breaking the glass. Detective Brown's report noted that the intruder had taken only small, high-value items that could be easily concealed and transported, including several expensive tools and a small amount of cash from the register. Subsequent break-ins at other businesses had followed a similar pattern. with the perpetrator consistently choosing rear or side entrances that were not visible from the street, and focusing on portable items that would be difficult to trace. Detective Brown's reports documented the evolution of the crime pattern, noting how the intruder seemed to be learning from each incident and becoming more sophisticated in choosing targets and methods. The investigation had proceeded methodically, with Detective Brown coordinating with other officers to increase patrols in commercial areas and working with business owners to improve security measures. His reports included detailed documentation of the physical evidence collected at each scene, witness interviews, and analysis of the patterns that might help predict future targets. Asterisk. The breakthrough in the case had come through careful observation and community cooperation rather than dramatic police work. Detective Brown had noticed that the businesses targeted were all located within walking distance of each other, and that the timing of the break-in suggested someone who was familiar with the area's normal patterns of activity. Working with this hypothesis, he had focused his investigation on people who lived or worked in the vicinity and who would have had opportunities to observe the targeted businesses during their normal daily routines. This approach had eventually led to the identification of 18-year-old Michael Torres, who worked at a gas station located centrally among the businesses that had been burglarized. Detective Brown's reports documented the careful process of building a case against Torres, including surveillance, witness interviews, and the eventual recovery of stolen merchandise from his apartment. The investigation had been conducted with particular attention to legal procedures and evidence handling, ensuring that the case would be prosecutable despite the lack of dramatic physical evidence linking Torres to the crimes. The resolution of the case had included Torres's confession to all the break-ins, along with his explanation that he had been stealing items to sell in order to pay for his girlfriend's medical bills. Detective Brown's final reports noted that Torres had been cooperative throughout the legal process and had expressed genuine remorse for his actions. Case file included documentation of the sentencing process, which had taken into account Torres's age, his lack of prior criminal history, and the circumstances that had motivated his crimes. Rather than receiving a lengthy prison sentence, he had been required to make restitution to the affected businesses and to perform extensive community service while completing his high school education. These property crime cases required particularly detailed documentation because of the need to establish clear evidence of criminal intent and to track the movement of stolen goods through various channels. Detective Brown's meticulous approach ensured that the investigation could withstand legal scrutiny while also addressing the underlying factors that had contributed to the criminal behavior. The reports from this period painted a picture of police work that balanced enforcement responsibilities with community service, recognizing that effective law enforcement required understanding the social and economic factors that contributed to criminal behavior. Officers like Detective Brown, Officer Washington, and Detective Morrison had developed approaches that went beyond simple arrest and prosecution to address the underlying causes of crime and conflict. Their careful documentation created a valuable record, not just of individual cases but of effective strategies for community policing that recognized the complex relationships between law enforcement, social services, and community development. The reports demonstrated that successful police work often required patience, creativity, and genuine concern for all members of the community, including those who had made mistakes that brought them into contact with the criminal justice system. As the summer of 1988 progressed, these officers continued to file reports that documented their ongoing efforts to maintain community safety while also supporting the positive development of individuals and families who were struggling with various challenges. Their work represented the best traditions of American policing, combining professional competence with human compassion in service of the broader goal of community well-being. Asterisk. The archive stretched beyond what any single person could explore in a lifetime. Corridor after corridor of filing cabinets reaching toward shadows that the overhead lights never quite managed to dispel. Here, in the oldest sections of the basement, the air itself seemed thick with memory, heavy with the accumulated weight of decades of human stories, carefully preserved in manila, folders and bound reports. Detective Sarah Chun had discovered sections of the archives that even the department's longest-serving officers had forgotten existed. Cabinet after cabinet of files from the 1970s and early 1980s. Their metal surfaces dulled by time, but their contents still meticulously organized according to the filing systems that had governed police work in those earlier decades. The paper in these older files had taken on a particular quality, yellowed at the edges and slightly brittle to the touch, but still legible, still holding its secrets with the patience that only properly archived documents could maintain. The typewriter ribbons from that era had created text with a distinctive character, each letter pressed firmly into the paper with the kind of permanence that spoke of an age when corrections were difficult and careful thought was required before committing words to the official record. She pulled open drawer 23A, one of a series that contained files from 1979, and immediately noticed the different organizational system that had been used during that period. Cases were filed not just by number and date but also by category, with colored tabs indicating whether incidents were classified as property crimes, personal disputes, traffic violations, or community disturbances. The system created a visual map of the types of problems that had occupied police attention during that particular year. The first file she examined dealt with a missing person case that had stretched across several months. In the autumn of 1979, Mrs. Dorothy Klein, a 47-year-old librarian, had disappeared from her home on a Thursday evening, leaving behind no note, no indication of her intentions, and no obvious signs of struggle or forced entry. The initial report, filed by Officer Martinez, had documented the careful search of her small apartment and the interviews with neighbors and colleagues who had known her daily routines. The report described Mrs. Klein as a quiet, methodical person who had lived alone since her divorce 3 years earlier. Her work at the public library had provided structure to her days, and her colleagues had described her as reliable and consistent in her habits. The sudden absence from work, without any advance notice or explanation, had been completely out of character and had prompted the initial missing person report. Officer Martinez had documented his investigation with the kind of thoroughness that characterized police work from that era. He had spent hours in Mrs. Klein's apartment, not looking for dramatic clues but simply trying to understand the rhythm of her daily life. The apartment had been neat and organized, with books arranged by subject, clothing hung carefully in the closet, and kitchen supplies stored with the precision that suggested someone who valued order and predictability. Yet within this order, Officer Martinez had found subtle signs that Mrs. Klein had been preparing for some kind of change. A suitcase was missing from her bedroom closet, though neighbors could not recall ever seeing her travel. Several books about Western states had been checked out from the library, an unusual choice for someone whose reading typically focused on classical literature and local history. Most significantly, Officer Martinez had discovered that Mrs. Klein had been systematically settling her affairs in the weeks before her disappearance. She had paid all her bills several months in advance, had closed a savings account that had contained nearly $3,000, and had given notice to her landlord that she would be moving out at the end of the month. Though she had not provided information about where she planned to relocate, the investigation had proceeded slowly. with Officer Martinez conducting interviews throughout the community to better understand Mrs. Klein's relationships and recent behavior. Her supervisor at the library had mentioned that she had seemed distracted during her final weeks of work, often staring out the window during quiet periods and asking unusual questions about library policies regarding extended leave and resignation procedures. A colleague named Mrs. Henderson had reported that Mrs. Klein had begun talking about her ex-husband more frequently in recent months, not with bitterness or anger, but with what seemed like renewed interest in understanding what had gone wrong in their marriage. She had mentioned receiving letters from him. The first communication they had shared since their divorce had been finalized. Officer Martinez had contacted Mrs. Klein's ex-husband, Robert Klein, who was living in Denver and working as an accountant for a construction company. Robert had confirmed that he had been writing to Dorothy, expressing regret about their divorce and suggesting that they might be able to rebuild their relationship if she were willing to consider relocating to Colorado. The letters, which Robert provided to Officer Martinez, revealed a gradual courtship that had been unfolding over several months. Robert had changed significantly since their divorce, completing treatment for alcoholism and establishing a stable career that provided him with the emotional and financial stability that had been lacking during their marriage. Dorothy's responses, copies of which Robert had kept, showed her careful consideration of his proposal. She had written about her loneliness since the divorce, her growing sense that the life she had built for herself was too small and predictable, and her cautious optimism about the possibility of starting over with the only person she had ever truly loved. The final letters in the correspondence had included specific plans for Dorothy's move to Denver, with Robert arranging temporary housing and helping her research job opportunities at libraries in the Colorado area. They had agreed that she would drive west during her vacation time from the library, allowing her to see the country and giving them both time to adjust to the idea of rebuilding their relationship. Officer Martinez had eventually located Dorothy in Denver, living in a small apartment near Robert's home and working part-time at a branch library while they explored the possibility of remarrying. She had been surprised and somewhat embarrassed to learn that her departure had prompted a missing person investigation, explaining that she had intended to contact her employer and landlord once she had decided whether to make the move permanent. The case had been closed with Dorothy's safe return to her home state to settle her affairs properly, followed by her official relocation to Denver several weeks later. Officer Martinez's final report had included a note that Dorothy and Robert had indeed remarried and were planning to purchase a home together in a suburb of Denver where Dorothy had accepted a full-time position as a children's librarian. The file contained a Christmas card that Dorothy had sent to Officer Martinez several months after the case was closed, thanking him for his patience and understanding during what she described as the most uncertain period of her adult life. The card included a photograph of her and Robert at their second wedding, a small ceremony that had taken place in a Denver park with only a few close friends in attendance. This case exemplified the kind of thorough, patient police work that had characterized the department's approach during that era. Officer Martinez had understood that missing person cases often involved complex personal decisions rather than criminal activity, and his investigation had been guided by concern for Dorothy's welfare rather than assumptions about what might have happened to her. Sarah moved deeper into the drawer, finding files that documented the wide range of situations that had required police attention during 1979. A theft case involving the disappearance of garden tools from several neighborhood garages had been solved through what the investigating officer described as community cooperation and patient observation rather than sophisticated detective work. Officer Johnson had approached the case by spending time in the affected neighborhood. Not conducting formal surveillance, but simply becoming familiar with the daily rhythms of the area. He had noticed that the thefts had occurred only on weekdays and only in the early morning hours, suggesting someone who was familiar with the residents, work schedules, and daily routines. The solution had come when Mrs. Patterson, an elderly resident who suffered from insomnia and often watched the neighborhood from her kitchen window during the early morning hours, had mentioned seeing a newspaper delivery truck making unusual stops in the alley behind several homes. Officer Johnson's investigation had revealed that the regular delivery driver had been replaced temporarily by his teenage nephew, who had been taking advantage of his access to residential areas to identify opportunities for easy theft. The case had been resolved when the nephew, 17-year-old David Murphy, had been confronted with the evidence and had confessed to taking the tools to sell for spending money. Officer Johnson's report noted that David had been genuinely remorseful about his actions and had willingly returned all the stolen items to their owners. The resolution had been handled through the juvenile court system, with David required to perform community service and make formal apologies to the affected families. Officer Johnson's follow-up reports had documented David's compliance with the court's requirements and his successful completion of his high school education without further incidents. These cases from 1979 reflected a time when police officers had more latitude for creative problem-solving and community engagement. The investigations were characterized by patience and thoroughness, rather than the pressure for quick resolution that would come to characterize police work in later decades. Sarah pulled another file, this one dealing with a vandalism case that had required several months to resolve. Someone had been painting messages on buildings throughout the downtown area. Not typical graffiti, but carefully crafted statements about local political issues and social concerns. The messages were articulate and thoughtful, written in elegant script that suggested someone with artistic training and strong opinions about community development. Detective Williams had approached the case not as simple vandalism, but as a form of unauthorized political expression that required understanding rather than mere enforcement. His reports documented his efforts to analyze the content of the messages, looking for clues about the author's background, interests, and motivations. The messages dealt with issues like historic preservation, affordable housing, and the impact of proposed commercial development on existing neighborhoods. They were written in a style that suggested familiarity with local government procedures and detailed knowledge of planning documents that were not easily accessible to the general public. Detective Williams had spent considerable time researching the issues referenced in the messages, attending city council meetings, and reviewing public records to better understand the political context that had motivated the vandalism. His investigation had led him to conclude that the author was likely someone with professional involvement in city planning or community development. The breakthrough had come when Detective Williams had noticed similarities between the language used in the file painted messages and the written comments submitted by citizens during public hearings on development proposals. One particular phrase, referring to the need to balance progress with preservation, had appeared both in a painted message and in a formal statement submitted by Margaret Foster, a local architect who specialized in historic preservation. The investigation had revealed that Margaret had been increasingly frustrated with what she saw as the city's indifference to community concerns about development projects that threatened historic neighborhoods. Her vandalism had been an act of civil disobedience, an attempt to force public attention to issues that she felt were being ignored by local officials. Detective Williams had approached Margaret not with an arrest warrant, but with an invitation to discuss her concerns and find legal ways to address the issues that had motivated her, unauthorized political expression. His report documented several meetings in which they had explored alternatives to vandalism for raising public awareness about preservation issues. The case had been resolved through a creative compromise that allowed Margaret to avoid criminal charges while channeling her activism into constructive political engagement. She had agreed to clean up the painted messages and to pay for any damage to private property, while also committing to work within legal channels to address her concerns about development policies. The resolution had led to Margaret's appointment to the city's Historic Preservation Commission, where her expertise and passion for preservation issues had contributed to the development of new policies that balance development needs with community concerns about maintaining neighborhood character. Detective Williams's final report had noted that Margaret's vandalism, while technically illegal, had succeeded in drawing public attention to important issues that might otherwise have been overlooked. Her appointment to the commission had transformed her from a problem to be solved into a community resource for addressing the underlying concerns that had motivated her civil disobedience. These cases from the late 1970s demonstrated a different approach to law enforcement, one that recognized the complex social and political factors that sometimes motivated apparently criminal behavior. Officers like Detective Williams had understood that effective police work sometimes required looking beyond the immediate violation to understand and address the underlying issues that created conflict between individuals and community. Standards. Sarah continued through the files, finding case after case that illustrated the patient, thoughtful approach that had characterized police work during that era. A domestic dispute case had been resolved through what Officer Rodriguez described as family counseling rather than legal intervention, with the officer serving as a mediator who helped family members develop better communication strategies and conflict resolution skills. The case had involved the Thompson family, where teenage children had been clashing with parents over curfews, household responsibilities, and academic expectations. The conflicts had escalated to the point where neighbors were calling police about loud arguing and occasional door slamming. But Officer Rodriguez's investigation had revealed that the family's problems stemmed from communication difficulties, rather than any serious behavioral issues. Officer Rodriguez had spent several evenings with the Thompson family, helping them establish family meetings where concerns could be discussed before they escalated into arguments. His reports documented the gradual improvement in family relationships as parents and children learned to express their needs and concerns more effectively. The case had been closed when the family reported that they had successfully negotiated agreements about household rules and expectations that satisfied everyone's needs for independence and security. Officer Rodriguez's follow-up reports had noted the family's continued success in managing conflicts through discussion rather than confrontation. These domestic cases required particular sensitivity because they involved intervention in private family matters, where the goal was not law enforcement, but family preservation and strengthening. Officer Rodriguez's approach had recognized that police involvement in family conflicts was most effective when it focused on building communication skills rather than simply responding to immediate crises. The archives from this period also contained extensive documentation of community policing initiatives that had been experimental at the time but would later become standard practice in many departments. Officer Chun had been assigned to what was then called the Community Relations Division, a small unit that focused on building relationships between police and community organizations. Her files from 1979 documented a series of programs designed to increase positive contact between police officers and community members. particularly young people who might otherwise have limited interaction with law enforcement. One particularly successful program had involved officers visiting schools, not to conduct drug education or safety presentations, but simply to have lunch with students and answer questions about police work. Officer Chen's reports described how these informal visits had gradually changed students' perceptions of police officers, transforming them from authority figures to be feared or avoided into community members who were available to help with problems and concerns. The program had been particularly effective in elementary schools, where young children had the opportunity to interact with officers in relaxed, non-threatening environments. The success of the school lunch program had led to expanded community engagement initiatives, including police participation in neighborhood festivals, youth sports leagues, and community service projects. Officer Chun's documentation showed how these programs had created positive relationships that made communities more willing to cooperate with police investigations and more likely to report suspicious activity or safety concerns. These community policing initiatives required officers to develop skills that went beyond traditional law enforcement training, including public speaking, youth development, and community organizing. Officer Chun's reports demonstrated that effective community policing required genuine commitment to building relationships rather than simply conducting public relations activities. The files from 1979 also included documentation of cases that would be considered unusual by modern standards, situations where police officers had been called upon to provide services that would later be handled by other agencies or professionals. One case involved Officer Martinez being asked to help an elderly man whose adult children were concerned about his ability to live independently. Mr. William Foster, age 78, had been living alone since his wife's death 2 years earlier. His children, who lived in other states, had become worried about his welfare after neighbors reported that he seemed confused and was having difficulty maintaining his home and personal care. The children had asked police to conduct a welfare check, hoping to assess whether their father needed assistance or supervision. Officer Martinez's report documented his careful approach to what was essentially a social service call rather than a law enforcement matter. He had spent several hours with Mr. Foster, assessing his mental clarity, his ability to manage daily tasks, and his social support network within the community. The investigation had revealed that Mr. Foster was experiencing some memory problems and occasional confusion, but that he was not in immediate danger and was receiving informal support from neighbors who checked on him regularly. His confusion had been most noticeable to people who didn't know him well, while neighbors who interacted with him daily had developed strategies for helping him manage tasks that had become difficult. Officer Martinez had worked with Mr. Foster's children and local social service agencies to develop a support plan that allowed him to remain in his own home while ensuring that he received appropriate assistance with tasks like grocery shopping, bill paying, and medical appointments. The plan had included regular visits from a home health aide and increased involvement from family members who committed to visiting more frequently. The case had been resolved without any formal intervention, but Officer Martinez's documentation had provided Mr. Foster's children with the information they needed to make appropriate arrangements for their father's care. His approach had balanced respect for Mr. Foster's independence with recognition that some additional support was necessary to ensure his safety and well-being. These kinds of cases demonstrated the broad scope of police work during that era, when officers were often called upon to address social problems that fell outside traditional law enforcement categories. The department's approach had been to respond to community needs rather than limiting police involvement to strictly criminal matters. Sarah found herself deeply moved by the humanity and creativity that characterized so much of the police work documented in these older files. Officers from that era had clearly understood their role within the broader context of community service. and their investigations had been guided by genuine concern for the welfare of all community members, rather than simple enforcement of legal standards. The cases she had reviewed painted a picture of police work that required patience, creativity, and genuine empathy for people who were struggling with various challenges. Whether dealing with missing persons, family conflicts, community disputes, or social service needs, officers had approached their work with recognition that effective solutions often required understanding and addressing underlying causes rather than simply responding to immediate symptoms. These archives represented more than just documentation of individual cases. They were a record of a different philosophy of law enforcement, one that recognized police officers as integral members of communities with responsibilities that extended beyond traditional crime fighting to include mediation, counseling, education, and social support. The filing cabinet stretched endlessly into the shadows, each one containing hundreds of similar stories, thousands of moments when police officers had chosen patience over force, understanding over judgment, and community service over simple law enforcement. These documented cases stood as testimony to the possibility of policing that served not just law and order but human dignity and community well-being. As Sarah continued her exploration of the archives, she carried with her a growing appreciation for the officers whose work was preserved in these files. They had understood something important about the nature of their profession, something that went beyond technical skills and legal knowledge to encompass the fundamental human abilities to listen, understand, and help people find ways to live together peacefully. The dust motes continued their slow dance through the fluorescent light, each particle carrying the essence of these carefully preserved stories. These quiet testimonies to the possibility of law enforcement that served not just justice but mercy, not just order but understanding, not just law but love. The old courthouse had stood at the center of downtown for nearly a century, its limestone facade weathered by countless seasons but still bearing the dignified presence that its architects had intended. During the daylight hours, the building hummed with activity lawyers consulting with clients, clerks filing documents, judges conducting hearings that would determine the course of people's lives. But in the evening hours, when the last case had been heard and the final document filed, the courthouse settled into a different kind of rhythm, one marked by silence and the weight of accumulated history. Detective Sarah Chun had occasion to visit the courthouse during these quiet evening hours, usually to retrieve files from the clerk's office or to prepare testimony for the following day's proceedings. She had grown to appreciate the building's after-hours atmosphere, the way the marble floors echoed with her footsteps but seemed to absorb all other sounds, creating a sense of solitude that was both peaceful and profound. The main corridor stretched the length of the building, lined with courtrooms whose heavy wooden doors bore brass plates indicating their designated purposes: criminal court, civil court, family court, probate court, each room representing a different aspect of the legal system's attempt to impose order on the complexity of human relationships and behavior. During the day, these rooms would be filled with the voices of attorneys, witnesses, and judges, all participating in the formal rituals through which society sought to resolve its conflicts and disputes. But in the evening, the courtroom stood empty, their wooden benches arranged in perfect rows, their flags hanging motionless in the still air. The witness stands waited silently for tomorrow's testimonies, while the judges' benches presided over spaces that held only shadows and the faint echoes of countless proceedings that had taken place within these walls. Sarah had always found something deeply moving about these empty courtrooms, the way they seemed to hold the memory of every case that had been heard, every decision that had been rendered, every moment when the formal machinery of justice had been applied to the messy realities of human conflict and suffering. The very air seemed thick with the accumulated weight of testimony, argument, and judgment that had filled these spaces over the decades. In courtroom 3, where Judge Morrison had presided for nearly 20 years. The wooden surfaces had taken on a particular patina from decades of use. The judge's bench bore the subtle marks of countless gavels, while the witness stand showed the wear patterns left by nervous hands, gripping its edges during difficult testimony. Even the gallery benches had been shaped by years of anxious family members and curious observers, their surfaces worn smooth by the fidgeting and shifting that accompanied the slow pace of legal proceedings. The cases that had been decided in this room represented the full spectrum of human experience and legal complexity. Simple traffic violations had been processed alongside complex criminal trials. Family custody disputes had been resolved next to corporate litigation, and probate matters had been settled, while estate disputes unfolded over months or years of careful deliberation. Sarah remembered sitting in this courtroom during the trial of Tommy Morrison, the teenager who had been arrested for the series of burglaries that Detective Williams had investigated several years earlier. The proceedings had been conducted with the careful attention to due process that characterized Judge Morrison's approach to juvenile cases, with particular emphasis on understanding the circumstances that had led to Tommy's criminal behavior rather than simply determining his guilt or innocence. The testimony had revealed the complex family dynamics and economic pressures that had contributed to Tommy's decision to steal items for his makeshift fort in the woods. Judge Morrison had listened patiently to statements from Tommy's parents, his teachers, and the victims of his thefts, gradually building a comprehensive understanding of the situation that would guide his sentencing decision. The courtroom had been nearly empty during most of the proceedings, with only Tommy's family, the investigating officers, and a few community members present to witness the careful deliberation that would determine the young man's future. The atmosphere had been serious but not harsh, reflecting Judge Morrison's understanding that juvenile cases required different approaches than adult criminal proceedings. The resolution had been innovative for its time, with Judge Morrison sentencing Tommy to a combination of community service, restitution, and what he called constructive supervision that would help the teenager develop better decision-making skills, while also addressing the underlying family issues that had contributed to his behavior. The sentence had been designed not just to punish Tommy's actions, but to provide him with the support and guidance necessary to prevent future problems. The case files from that period, which Sarah had reviewed in the archives, included letters from Tommy written several years after his trial, updating Judge Morrison on his progress through high school and his plans for college. The judge had maintained an informal mentoring relationship with Tommy, providing encouragement and advice that had helped the young man overcome the challenges that had initially led him into conflict with the law. This kind of ongoing engagement between judges and the people whose cases they decided had been more common during that era, when the pace of legal proceedings allowed for the personal attention that could make the difference between punishment and rehabilitation. Judge Morrison's approach had been based on the understanding that effective justice often required addressing the underlying causes of criminal behavior rather than simply imposing penalties for illegal actions. Courtroom 5 had been the domain of Judge Patterson, who had specialized in family court matters and had developed particular expertise in handling domestic disputes, custody cases, and adoption proceedings. The atmosphere in this courtroom had always been different from the more formal criminal and civil courts, with Judge Patterson encouraging a conversational tone that helped family members express their concerns and work toward resolutions that served the best interests of children and preserved family relationships whenever possible. Sarah had testified in this courtroom during several domestic violence cases, providing evidence that had helped Judge Patterson make difficult decisions about protective orders, custody arrangements, and mandated counseling programs. The judge had always been particularly careful to ensure that all parties understood the reasoning behind his decisions and the resources available to help them address the underlying Issues that had brought them into the court system. One particularly memorable case had involved the Rodriguez family, whose domestic disputes had been documented in Detective Morrison's files from 1988. The family had appeared before Judge Patterson not for criminal proceedings, but for mediation services that the court provided to help families resolve conflicts before they escalated to the point where legal intervention became necessary. Judge Patterson had worked with the Rodriguez family over several months, helping them develop communication strategies and conflict resolution skills that addressed the financial stress and generational differences that had been creating tension in their household. The proceedings had been conducted in a conference room adjacent to the courtroom, providing a more informal setting that encouraged honest discussion rather than adversarial confrontation. The success of the COFR mediation had been documented in follow-up reports that Judge Patterson required in all family cases, tracking the family's progress in implementing the agreements they had reached during their court sessions. The Rodriguez family had continued to meet with court-appointed counselors for several months, gradually developing the skills necessary to manage conflicts without external intervention. Years later, Mrs. Rodriguez had written to Judge Patterson to thank him for his patience and understanding during what she described as one of the most difficult periods in her family's life. She had reported that the skills they had learned during their court sessions had not only resolved their immediate conflicts, but had also strengthened their relationships and improved their ability to handle future challenges. That these family court proceedings had required judges to serve roles that went beyond traditional legal decision-making to include counseling, mediation, and social work. Judge Patterson had developed expertise in child development, family dynamics, and community resources that allowed him to craft solutions that addressed the specific needs of each family that appeared before him. The courthouse also contained spaces that were less visible to the public but equally important to the administration of justice. The holding cells in the basement had been designed not just for security, but for the humane treatment of people who were awaiting trial or serving short sentences. The cells were small but clean, with adequate lighting and ventilation that reflected the understanding that even people accused of crimes deserved to be treated with basic dignity. Detective Chun had visited these holding areas on numerous occasions, conducting interviews with suspects and witnesses, or simply checking on the welfare of people who had been arrested during her investigations. The atmosphere in the holding area had always been serious but not oppressive, with correctional officers who understood that their job was to maintain security, while also preserving the humanity of the people in their custody. Asterisk. The holding cells had seen their share of human drama over the years, from teenagers arrested for minor offenses who spent a few hours in custody before being released to their parents, to adults facing serious charges who might spend days or weeks awaiting trial. Each cell had witnessed moments of fear, regret, anger, and occasionally relief, as people confronted the consequences of their actions and contemplated the changes they would need to make in their lives. One cell in particular, Cell 3, had been modified to accommodate elderly or disabled detainees, with a lower bunk and handholds that made it easier for people with mobility limitations to navigate this small space. This modification had been made after an incident involving an elderly man who had been arrested for shoplifting and had struggled with the standard cell configuration. The man, 72-year-old Harold Peterson, had been caught stealing food from a local grocery store, not because of economic need, but because of confusion related to early-stage dementia that his family had not yet recognized. Detective Johnson, who had investigated the case, had quickly realized that Mr. Peterson's situation required social services rather than criminal prosecution. The modified cell had allowed Mr. Peterson to remain in custody safely while Detective Johnson worked with social services and the man's family to develop an appropriate response to his condition. The case had been resolved without criminal charges, with Mr. Peterson receiving the medical evaluation and family support that addressed the underlying cause of his apparent criminal behavior. The courthouse basement also contained the evidence storage facility, where physical evidence from criminal cases was preserved, according to strict protocols that ensured its integrity and availability for trial proceedings. The storage area was organized with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all aspects of the court system, with each item cataloged, labeled, and stored under conditions that would preserve its evidentiary value. Sarah had spent countless hours in the evidence storage area, reviewing physical evidence from cases she was investigating or preparing for trial testimony. The room had a particular atmosphere of quiet concentration, with the understanding that the items stored there might be crucial to determining guilt or innocence in criminal proceedings. The evidence from the Morrison burglary case was still stored in the facility, carefully preserved in labeled containers that maintained the chain of custody required for legal proceedings. The recovered jewelry box, the tools that had been stolen, and the photographs of Tommy's fort in the woods were all available for review. Though the case had been closed for several years, each piece of evidence told part of the story of Tommy's brief criminal career. But more importantly, they represented the careful police work that had solved the case and the thoughtful judicial approach that had addressed the underlying causes of his behavior. The evidence storage facility served not just as a repository for physical items, but as a museum of the criminal justice system's attempts to understand and respond to human behavior. The courthouse's architectural features had been designed to convey the dignity and authority of the legal system while also creating an atmosphere that encouraged respect for the rule of law. The high ceilings, marble columns, and ornate details reflected the understanding that justice required not just functional spaces but environments that reinforced the importance of the proceedings that took place within them. The main staircase, which connected the building's 3 floors, had been carved from a single piece of marble and polished to a surface that reflected the soft light from the tall windows that lined the corridor. Generations of lawyers, judges, witnesses, and defendants had climbed these stairs, each carrying their own hopes, fears, and expectations about the legal proceedings that awaited them. The second floor housed the appellate court, where cases from the lower courts were reviewed by panels of judges who examined legal procedures and constitutional issues rather than determining facts or guilt. The appellate courtroom was smaller than the trial courts, but equally dignified, with leather-bound law books lining the walls and portraits of former judges creating a visual reminder of the legal tradition that guided contemporary proceedings. Appeals cases moved at an even more deliberate pace than trial proceedings, with written briefs, oral arguments, and careful deliberation that could extend over months or years. The appellate process represented the legal system's commitment to accuracy and fairness, providing multiple opportunities for review and correction that helped ensure that justice was not only done, but seen to be done. Sarah had testified in appellate proceedings on several occasions, usually in cases where her investigative techniques or evidence collection procedures had been challenged by defense attorneys. The appellate court's review had always been thorough and fair, with judges who understood the practical realities of police work while also maintaining high standards for constitutional protections and due process. At the 3rd floor of the courthouse contained the law library, which served not only the legal professionals who worked in the building, but also members of the public who needed to research legal questions or prepare documents for court proceedings. The library had been designed as a working space where the complex machinery of legal research could be conducted with the resources and quiet concentration that such work required. Law Library's collection included not only current statutes and case law but also historical legal documents that provided insight into the evolution of legal principles and judicial interpretation. Legal scholars and historians occasionally visited the library to research questions about the development of local legal institutions and the changing approaches to criminal justice that had characterized different eras. During evening hours, the law library was usually empty except for the occasional attorney preparing for a complex case or a law student researching a thesis project. The silence in the library was different from the silence in the courtrooms, less weighted with human drama, but equally profound in its reflection of the intellectual tradition that guided legal decision-making. The building's heating system created subtle sounds that became noticeable only during the quietest hours. Gentle hums and occasional clicks that provided a barely audible soundtrack to the courthouse's evening solitude. These mechanical sounds seemed to emphasize the building's role as a functional institution, a place where the abstract principles of justice were applied to the concrete realities of human conflict and social order. The security systems that protected the courthouse during non-business hours included not only electronic monitoring but also regular patrols by officers who understood that the building contained not just valuable equipment but irreplaceable legal documents and evidence that represented years of careful work by police officers, attorneys, and court personnel. The night security officers had developed their own appreciation for the building's atmosphere and history, often pausing during their rounds to reflect on the important work that took place within these walls. They understood that their role was not just to protect physical property, but to preserve the institutional integrity that made the courthouse a trusted center for the resolution of community conflicts and disputes. Building's windows, which had been designed to provide natural light during daytime proceedings, took on a different character in the evening hours, becoming dark mirrors that reflected the interior lights while concealing the activities inside from outside observation. This sense of privacy and protection reinforced the courthouse's role as a sanctuary where sensitive legal matters could be discussed and decided without external pressure or interference. The courthouse represented more than just a functional space for legal proceedings. It embodied the community's commitment to resolving conflicts through reason, evidence, and established procedures, rather than through force or arbitrary decision-making. The building's dignity and permanence conveyed the understanding that justice required not just good intentions, but institutional stability and continuity that could withstand political changes and social pressures. As Sarah walked through the empty corridors during her evening visits, she often reflected on the thousands of cases that had been decided within these walls, the countless moments when individual lives had been shaped by legal proceedings that balanced competing interests and sought to achieve fair outcomes in complex human situations. The courthouse stood as a monument to the possibility of civilized dispute resolution, a physical reminder that communities could choose law over violence, reason over passion, and justice over revenge. The building would continue its quiet vigil through the night, preserving the legal documents and evidence that represented society's ongoing attempt to create order and fairness in a world that often seemed chaotic and unjust. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities for the legal system to demonstrate its capacity for wisdom, mercy, and justice in service of the common good. In the darkness, the courthouse rested but remained ready, its empty courtrooms waiting for tomorrow's proceedings, its filing systems maintaining their careful organization, its security systems protecting the institutional integrity that made civilized legal resolution possible. The building itself had become part of the community's legal tradition, a physical embodiment of the principle that justice while sometimes slow and imperfect, was preferable to all the alternatives that human societies had tried throughout history. Asterisk. The neighborhoods spread outward from the city center like ripples in still water, each one carrying its own particular character shaped by decades of families who had chosen to make their lives within its boundaries. Detective Sarah Chun had come to understand that effective police work required more than responding to individual incidents. It meant understanding the intricate web of relationships that connected neighbors to each other and created the social fabric that made community life possible. Maple Street had been her assigned patrol area for several years, a collection of modest homes built in the 1950s, where 3 generations of families had often lived within walking distance of each other. The street had the kind of established rhythm that came from years of shared experience, where neighbors knew each other's daily routines and looked out for each other's children with the casual attention that characterized close-knit. COMMUNITIES. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman lived in the White House with blue shutters at 1247 Maple Street, the same address where she had raised 4 children and now watched over 7 grandchildren who visited regularly for Sunday dinners and summer afternoons in her carefully maintained backyard. She had become something of an informal neighborhood coordinator, the person others called when they needed to organize block parties, coordinate snow removal, or address concerns about traffic safety or property maintenance. Eleanor's involvement in neighborhood affairs had begun naturally, growing out of her concern for the children who walked to school along Maple Street each morning. She had noticed that cars often drove too fast through the residential area, particularly during rush hours when commuters used neighborhood streets to avoid traffic on the main roads. Her initial conversations with neighbors about this concern had led to a petition requesting traffic calming measures from the city. Detective Chen had first met Eleanor during the traffic safety campaign, when the neighborhood association had requested police support for their efforts to reduce speeding through residential areas. The meeting had taken place in Eleanor's living room, with nearly 20 neighbors gathered to discuss their concerns and develop strategies for making their streets safer for children and elderly residents. The conversation had revealed the deep connections that existed between neighbors who had shared the same community for years. Mr. Peterson, who lived across the street from Eleanor, had mentioned his willingness to help elderly neighbors with snow removal and yard work. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose children attended the local elementary school, had offered to coordinate carpools for working parents who needed assistance with school transportation. These informal support networks had grown organically over years of shared experiences, creating a kind of social insurance system where neighbors helped each other through temporary difficulties and celebrated each other's successes. The traffic safety issue had provided an opportunity for neighbors to recognize and formalize the mutual assistance that had already been occurring quietly throughout the community. The traffic calming campaign had been successful, with the city installing speed bumps and additional stop signs that reduced vehicle speeds and improved safety for pedestrians. But more importantly, the campaign had strengthened the social connections that made Maple Street a place where people looked out for each other and took collective responsibility for maintaining the quality of community life. Detective Chun had observed similar patterns throughout her patrol area. Neighborhoods where strong social connections created informal systems of mutual support and collective problem-solving that reduced the likelihood of crime and increased the effectiveness of police intervention when problems did arise. These communities had developed what researchers would later call social capital, the networks of relationships and shared values that enabled collective action for mutual benefit. Oak Avenue, another street in Detective Chun's patrol area, had faced different challenges that had tested the strength of community connections. The street had experienced a series of break-ins during the summer of 1989. Incidents that had created fear and suspicion among neighbors who had previously felt secure in their homes and confident about leaving children outside to play. The break-ins had followed a pattern that suggested someone familiar with the neighborhood's daily rhythms was choosing times when homes were most likely to be empty. Detective Chun's investigation had revealed that the perpetrator was selecting houses where families were known to be at work or on vacation, suggesting someone who had been observing the area carefully and developing detailed knowledge of resident schedules. The investigation had proceeded slowly, with Detective Chun conducting interviews throughout the neighborhood to gather information about suspicious activities and to better understand the social dynamics that might help identify the person responsible for the crimes. These conversations had revealed the complex network of informal communication that kept neighbors informed about each other's activities and alert to unusual occurrences. Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the corner house and spent much of her time tending her front garden, had become an unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator simply by virtue of her position and daily routine. Her garden work provided natural opportunities to observe street activity and to chat with neighbors about their comings and goings. She had noticed that a young man she didn't recognize had been walking through the neighborhood regularly, always during midday hours when most residents were at work. The young man, Mrs. Patterson reported, had seemed to be paying particular attention to houses rather than simply walking for exercise or recreation. He had been carrying a clipboard and had occasionally stopped to write notes, behavior that might have seemed normal for someone conducting surveys or delivering services, but had struck Mrs. Patterson as unusual because he never approached front doors or attempted to contact residents. Detective Chun's investigation had eventually identified the young man as David Morrison, a 22-year-old college student who had been conducting what he called housing research for a sociology project, but had been using the information he gathered to identify opportunities for burglary. David had been systematically observing neighborhood patterns, noting which houses appeared to be empty during particular times and identifying homes that contained valuable items visible through windows. The case had been solved through a combination of careful police work and community cooperation, with neighbors providing information that helped Detective Chun understand the pattern of observation that had preceded the actual break-ins. David's arrest had been made without drama during one of his reconnaissance walks through the neighborhood. When Detective Chun had approached him and discovered the detailed notes he had been keeping about residents' schedules and property, the resolution of the case had brought the Oak Avenue community closer together, with neighbors who had been frightened and suspicious during the break-ins developing stronger connections and communication systems that would help prevent similar problems in the future. The experience had taught them the importance of paying attention to unusual activities and communicating concerns to each other and to police before problems escalated. David Morrison's case had been handled through the juvenile court system despite his age, because the judge had determined that his criminal behavior was related to poor judgment and economic pressure rather than malicious intent. David had been required to make full restitution to his victims and to perform extensive community service in the same neighborhood where he had committed the burglaries. The community service component of David's sentence had been designed not just as punishment, but as an opportunity for him to understand the impact of his actions on the families he had victimized. He had worked on various neighborhood improvement projects, including helping elderly residents with yard work and home maintenance tasks that allowed him to see the people he had harmed as individuals rather than anonymous targets. Detective Chun's follow-up reports had documented the gradual development of positive relationships between David and several of the neighbors he had initially victimized. His genuine remorse and willingness to make amends had impressed community members who had initially been angry and fearful about his crimes. Several neighbors had written letters to the court, supporting David's successful completion of his community service and recommending that he be given opportunities for educational advancement rather than further punishment. Oak Avenue case had demonstrated the capacity of strong neighborhoods to absorb and heal from criminal activity when the response emphasized restoration rather than simple punishment. The community's willingness to work with David during his community service had transformed a source of fear and division into an opportunity for mutual understanding and community strengthening. Pine Street had presented different challenges that had required Detective Chun to understand family dynamics and cultural differences that influenced how community members related to law enforcement and to each other. The street was home to several immigrant families who had recently arrived in the United States and were still learning to navigate American legal and social systems. Cultural differences had become apparent during a domestic dispute call that had brought Detective Chun to the home of the Nguyen family, where generational conflicts about traditional values and American customs had created tensions that the family was struggling to resolve. The dispute had been reported by neighbors who were concerned about loud arguments but had not understood the cultural context that was contributing to the family's conflicts. Mr. and Mrs. Nguyen, who had immigrated from Vietnam 5 years earlier, had been trying to maintain traditional family structures and values while also adapting to American society and supporting their children's integration into American schools and social activities. Their teenage children had been experiencing conflicts between their parents' expectations and the freedoms that their American peers enjoyed, creating stress that occasionally erupted into family arguments. Detective Chun's intervention had required sensitivity to cultural differences and recognition that the family's conflicts were related to the broader challenges of immigration and cultural adaptation rather than simple family dysfunction. Her approach had emphasized mediation and cultural understanding rather than law enforcement, helping the family develop communication strategies that respected both traditional values and American customs. The resolution had involved connecting the Nguyen family with community resources that specialized in supporting immigrant families, including cultural organizations that provided translation services, educational support, and social activities that helped families maintain their cultural identity while adapting to American society. Detective Chun had also worked with school counselors to ensure that the Nguyen children received appropriate support for navigating the cultural differences they experienced between home and school. The success of the intervention had led to Detective Chun being asked to serve as a liaison between the police department and the growing immigrant community in her patrol area. This role had involved developing relationships with community leaders and cultural organizations that could help bridge the gap between law enforcement and families who might be reluctant to contact police because of negative experiences with authority figures in their countries of origin. The immigrant community outreach had become one of Detective Chun's most rewarding responsibilities, allowing her to help families who were struggling with cultural adaptation while also building trust between law enforcement and community members who might otherwise have remained isolated from mainstream social services and support systems. Cedar Street had been home to the Rodriguez family, whose financial struggles and family conflicts had been documented in earlier police reports, but had eventually been resolved through the patient intervention of officers who understood that effective police work sometimes required addressing underlying social and economic problems rather than simply responding to immediate crises. The Rodriguez family story had become something of a success story within the department, demonstrating how thoughtful police intervention combined with community support could help families overcome temporary difficulties and develop the skills necessary for long-term stability and success. Mr. Rodriguez had found steady employment that provided adequate income for his family's needs, while Mrs. Rodriguez had completed training that qualified her for better paying work that gave her greater independence and financial security. Their children had benefited from the family's improved stability, with better academic performance and increased involvement in school and community activities that provided positive outlets for their energy and talents. The family had also become active in neighborhood improvement efforts, volunteering for community service projects and serving as mentors for other families who were struggling with similar challenges. The Rodriguez family's transformation had occurred gradually over several years, supported by a network of community resources that included job training programs, family counseling services, and informal support from neighbors who had taken an interest in their success. Detective Chun had maintained periodic contact with the family, not as a law enforcement officer, but as a community member who had been involved in their journey toward stability and success. The family's success had demonstrated the importance of long-term thinking and sustained support in addressing the underlying causes of family crisis and community problems. Their story had become an example that Detective Chun shared with other officers who were working with families in similar situations, showing how patient, comprehensive intervention could produce lasting positive changes that benefited not only individual families, but entire neighborhoods. Elm Street had been the site of one of Detective Chun's most challenging cases, involving an elderly resident whose increasing confusion and social isolation had created safety concerns for both himself and his neighbors. Mr. Harold Peterson, age 79, had been living alone since his wife's death 3 years earlier and had been gradually losing the ability to manage his daily activities and maintain his property. The situation had come to police attention when neighbors reported that Mr. Peterson had been leaving his stove on for hours at a time, creating concerns about fire safety that affected the entire block of closely spaced homes. He had also been having difficulty managing his finances, with unpaid bills accumulating and utility services threatened with disconnection. Detective Chun's initial assessment had revealed that Mr. Peterson was experiencing early-stage dementia that was making it difficult for him to remember routine tasks and manage complex activities like bill paying and household maintenance. However, he was still capable of living independently with appropriate support and supervision, and he was strongly resistant to the idea of moving to an assisted living facility. The solution had required extensive coordination between Detective Chun, social service agencies, Mr. Peterson's adult children who lived in other states, and neighbors who were willing to provide informal support and monitoring. The approach had emphasized maintaining Mr. Peterson's independence while ensuring his safety and the safety of his neighbors. The support plan had included daily check-ins from neighbors, weekly visits from a home health aide, and monthly visits from his adult children who took responsibility for managing his finances and medical care. Detective Chun had coordinated these services and had maintained periodic contact to ensure that the arrangement was working effectively for everyone involved. The case had required ongoing attention over several years, with adjustments to the support plan as Mr. Peterson's condition gradually changed and his needs for assistance increased. The collaborative approach had allowed him to remain in his own home much longer than would have been possible without community support, while also ensuring that safety concerns were addressed promptly and effectively. Mr. Peterson's situation had highlighted the challenges facing aging communities where long-term residents were experiencing health problems that affected their ability to maintain their homes and participate in community life. Detective Chun had worked with city officials and social service agencies to develop policies and programs that could provide systematic support for elderly residents while preserving the character and stability of established neighborhoods. The success of Mr. Peterson's support plan had led to the development of a neighborhood-based aging-in-place program that provided similar services for other elderly residents who wanted to remain in their homes but needed assistance with daily activities. The program had become a model for other communities that were facing similar demographic challenges and wanted to support aging residents while maintaining neighborhood stability. These neighborhood stories represented the broader patterns that characterized Detective Chun's approach to community policing, recognizing that effective law enforcement required understanding and addressing the social, economic, and cultural factors that influenced community life and individual behavior. Her work had demonstrated that police officers could serve as catalysts for community development and social problem solving, rather than simply responding to crimes after they had already occurred. The families and neighborhoods in Detective Chun's patrol area had taught her that crime prevention was often more effective than crime response, and that building strong community connections was one of the most important strategies for maintaining public safety and quality of life. Her experience had shown that police officers who took the time to understand the communities they served could play crucial roles in strengthening the social fabric that made peaceful community life possible. The stories from Maple Street, Oak Avenue, Pine Street, Cedar Street, and Elm Street had become part of Detective Chun's understanding of how communities actually function beneath the surface of their apparent order and stability. Each neighborhood had its own particular challenges and strengths, but all had demonstrated the capacity for mutual support and collective problem solving that made them resilient in the face of various difficulties. These neighborhood experiences had shaped Detective Chun's philosophy of policing, convincing her that the most important work she did was not solving individual crimes, but building relationships and supporting community development that prevented problems from developing and provided resources for addressing challenges when they did arise. Her patrol area had become a laboratory for exploring the connections between law enforcement and community development, demonstrating that police work at its best served not just law and order, but human flourishing and social justice. The quiet streets continued their daily rhythms, families sharing meals and stories, neighbors helping each other with small tasks and major challenges, children playing in yards watched over by adults who understood that community safety was everyone's responsibility. These ordinary moments of connection and mutual care represented the foundation upon which all effective policing was built, the social relationships that made law enforcement possible and meaningful in a democratic society. The police station transformed during the night shift, shedding the bustling energy of daytime operations and settling into a different kind of rhythm, one marked by the soft hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional crackle of radio transmissions, and the steady scratch of pens across report forms. The building seemed to breathe more slowly during these hours, as if conserving energy for the next day's demands while maintaining the essential functions that kept the community safe through the dark hours. Sergeant Williams had been working the night shift for nearly 8 years, long enough to understand its particular character and appreciate the unique perspective it provided on police work. The night shift attracted officers who preferred the slower pace and greater autonomy that came with working when administrative oversight was minimal and the focus shifted from bureaucratic requirements to the essential work of public safety and community service. The night shift began officially at 11 p.m. when the day shift officers completed their final reports and turned over any ongoing investigations to their colleagues who would maintain continuity through the overnight hours. The transition was always marked by a brief meeting in the main conference room, where Sergeant Williams reviewed the day's significant incidents and discussed any special concerns or Priorities for the night ahead. These transition meetings had their own ritual quality. A moment when the accumulated knowledge and experience of the day shift was formally passed to the night shift officers, who would carry it forward through the quiet hours. The conversations were typically brief and professional, but they represented an important link in the chain of continuous police coverage that protected the community around the clock. Officer Martinez had been part of the night shift team for 3 years. Drawn to the work by its combination of independence and community connection. During the night hours, officers worked with greater individual discretion, making decisions about minor incidents that might require supervisory consultation during busier day shifts. This autonomy had allowed Officer Martinez to develop his own approach to community policing, building relationships with night shift workers, late-night business owners, and residents who appreciated having police presence during the hours when they felt most vulnerable. The station's main desk during night shift was typically staffed by Officer Rodriguez, who served as the central communication point for all overnight activities. Her desk was positioned near the main entrance, allowing her to greet walk-in visitors while monitoring radio, communications from patrol units, and maintaining contact with other emergency services. The desk area had been arranged to create a welcoming environment for people who needed to report crimes or seek assistance during overnight hours. Officer Rodriguez had developed particular expertise in handling calls from people who were experiencing domestic violence, understanding that the decision to seek help often came during late-night hours when fear and desperation overcame the barriers that prevented victims from reaching out during the day. Her patient, non-judgmental approach had earned the trust of women and men who found themselves in dangerous situations and needed immediate assistance and long-term support. The domestic violence calls that came during night shift often required delicate handling, as victims were frequently calling from homes where their abusers were present or nearby. Officer Rodriguez had learned to read the subtle signals that indicated someone was in immediate danger, asking questions that could be answered with simple yes or no responses, and providing information about safety resources without requiring lengthy conversations that might put callers at additional risk. One particularly memorable case had involved a young mother who had called the station at 2 a.m., claiming to report a suspicious noise in her neighborhood, but actually seeking help for an escalating domestic situation. Officer Rodriguez had recognized the coded nature of the call and had dispatched officers to the address, while maintaining telephone contact with the caller until police arrived. The responding officers, led by Sergeant Williams, had found a situation that required immediate intervention to protect the woman and her 2 young children from an intoxicated partner who had been threatening violence. The arrest had been made without incident, but the real work had begun afterward, as Officer Rodriguez had spent the remainder of her shift connecting the family with emergency shelter services and advocacy resources that could provide ongoing support. The case had been resolved through a combination of criminal prosecution and civil protective orders that allowed the family to remain in their home while ensuring their safety from further violence. Officer Rodriguez had maintained contact with the family for several months, checking on their welfare and helping them navigate the complex process of rebuilding their lives. Without the presence of an abusive partner, these domestic violence cases represented some of the most challenging and rewarding work that came to the night shift, requiring officers to serve simultaneously as law enforcement officials, crisis counselors, and social service coordinators. The quiet hours provided more time for the careful attention that these situations required, allowing officers to build trust with victims and develop comprehensive safety plans that addressed both immediate dangers and long-term security needs. The night shift also handled the overflow of property crime investigations that had been initiated during day shifts but required follow-up work that extended beyond normal business hours. Detective Thompson, who worked a modified schedule that overlapped with both day and night shifts, often used the quiet evening hours to review case files and conduct analysis that required sustained concentration. Detective Thompson's desk was located in a corner of the main office area, positioned near a window that provided natural light during evening hours and a view of the parking lot that allowed him to observe the comings and goings of officers and visitors. His workspace was organized with the systematic attention to detail that characterized experienced investigators, with case files arranged by priority and reference materials positioned for easy access. During long periods of focused work, the property crime cases that occupied much of Detective Thompson's attention during night shifts often involved patterns that became apparent only through careful analysis of multiple incidents over extended periods. Burglary patterns, vehicle theft trends, and vandalism clusters required the kind of sustained attention that was difficult to maintain during the interruptions and distractions of day shift operations. One ongoing investigation that had consumed many of Detective Thompson's night shift hours involved a series of commercial burglaries that had been occurring throughout the city over a 6-month period. The crime shared certain characteristics that suggested a single perpetrator or group, but the pattern was subtle enough that it had taken weeks of careful analysis to identify the connections between incidents. The burglaries had targeted small businesses during overnight hours, with the perpetrator demonstrating knowledge of alarm systems and security procedures that suggested either professional training or extensive observation. The stolen items were typically small, valuable merchandise that could be easily transported and resold, indicating someone who understood both the practical challenges of burglary and the economics of disposing of stolen goods. Detective Thompson's analysis had focused on identifying the common factors that connected the targeted businesses, looking for patterns in location, timing, security measures, and business operations that might help predict future targets or identify the perpetrator. The work required hours of careful comparison between incident reports, supplemented by site visits and interviews with business owners that often extended into the evening hours. The investigation had eventually led to the identification of a former security company employee who had used his knowledge of alarm systems and client procedures to identify opportunities for burglary. The arrest had been made during a night shift operation that had involved several officers working together to apprehend the suspect. During an attempted break-in at a business that had been identified as a likely target, the resolution of the commercial burglary case had demonstrated the value of the sustained analysis that was possible during night shift hours, when officers had the time and concentration necessary to identify subtle patterns and develop comprehensive investigative strategies. The case had also highlighted the collaborative nature of night shift work, with officers from different specialties working together to achieve results that would have been difficult to accomplish individually. The night shift's responsibilities also included maintaining security at the station itself, ensuring that evidence was properly secured, that sensitive documents were protected, and that the building's various systems continued to function properly. Officer Kim, who served as the overnight security coordinator, conducted regular rounds through the building's various sections, checking locks, monitoring alarm systems, and ensuring that all areas were properly secured. These security rounds had their own meditative quality, taking Officer Kim through the archives, the evidence storage areas, the holding cells, and the various offices that made up the station's complex infrastructure. The building was different during night hours, quieter and more introspective, allowing for a deeper appreciation of the institutional memory and accumulated wisdom that was preserved within its walls. The evidence storage area took on a particularly solemn character during overnight hours, with row upon row of carefully cataloged items representing years of police work and community history. Officer Kim had developed a personal ritual of spending a few minutes during each round reading through evidence logs and case summaries, maintaining his connection to the broader mission of the department while performing the routine tasks of security maintenance. The holding cells, rarely occupied during night shift hours, served as reminders of the human cost of crime and the department's responsibility to treat all people with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. Officer Kim had occasionally been called upon to monitor detainees who were being held overnight, providing basic care and ensuring their safety while they awaited morning court appearances or release procedures. These interactions with detainees had taught Officer Kim about the complex factors that contributed to criminal behavior, from substance abuse and mental health issues to economic desperation and family dysfunction. The night hours provided opportunities for quieter conversations that revealed the human stories behind the official charges and helped officers understand their role in the broader effort to address the root causes of crime and social disorder. The radio room during night shift was staffed by Officer Chun, who served as the central communication hub for all patrol units and emergency responses. The radio room had been equipped with multiple monitoring systems that allowed continuous contact with officers in the field while maintaining communication with other emergency services, including fire departments, ambulance services, and neighboring police jurisdictions. Officer Chun had developed expertise in managing multiple simultaneous communications while maintaining awareness of each officer's location and status throughout the night. Her calm, professional voice had become a familiar presence for night shift officers, providing reassurance and support during difficult situations while coordinating resources and backup when needed. The radio communications during night shift often had a different character than daytime operations, with longer periods of quiet punctuated by more serious incidents that required careful coordination and sustained attention. Officer Chun had learned to read the subtle changes in officers' voices that indicated stress or concern, responding with additional support or resources before situations escalated beyond individual officers' ability to handle them safely. When particularly challenging, night had involved a multi-vehicle accident on the main highway that required coordination between police, fire, and medical personnel while maintaining normal patrol coverage for the rest of the city. Officer Chun had managed communications for the accident response while tracking the location and status of patrol units that were handling routine calls throughout the city. The accident had involved fatalities and serious injuries that had required several hours of investigation and cleanup, stretching the night shift's resources and testing their ability to maintain normal operations while managing a major emergency response. Officer Chun's coordination had been crucial to ensuring that all aspects of the response were properly managed while maintaining public safety throughout the rest of the city. The resolution of the accident response had demonstrated the night shift's capacity for handling complex emergency situations with limited resources and minimal supervisory oversight. The collaboration between officers, dispatchers, and emergency personnel had been seamless, reflecting the professional relationships and mutual trust that developed among night shift workers who depended on each other for support during challenging situations. The paperwork generated during night shift operations was typically completed during the quiet hours between calls, when officers had the time and concentration necessary for thorough documentation of their activities. The station's main office area during night hours became a quiet workspace where officers could complete reports, research case information, and prepare materials for follow-up investigation during day shifts. The report writing during night shift often had a more reflective quality than the hurried documentation that characterized busy day shift operations. Officers had more time to consider their observations and experiences, creating more detailed and thoughtful reports that provided better documentation for prosecutorial review and appeal processes. Sergeant Williams had established a practice of reviewing all night shift reports before they were filed, not as a supervisory requirement, but as a quality assurance measure that ensured consistency and completeness in documentation. These review sessions often became teaching opportunities where more experienced officers shared insights and techniques with newer members of the night shift team. The collaborative approach to report review had created a learning environment where officers continuously improved their skills in observation, analysis, and written communication. The night shift had developed a reputation within the department for producing high-quality reports that were particularly useful for complex investigations and court proceedings. The quiet hours of night shift also provided opportunities for professional development and training that was difficult to accomplish during the demands of day shift operations. Officers used the slower pace to study new procedures, review case law, and discuss challenging situations with colleagues who had similar experiences and perspectives. These informal training sessions had become an important component of the night shift's professional culture, creating an environment where continuous learning and improvement were encouraged and supported. The collaborative approach to professional development had strengthened the entire night shift team while improving the quality of service provided to the community during overnight hours. As dawn approached and the night shift prepared for the transition to day operations, there was always a sense of accomplishment that came from maintaining the community's safety through the vulnerable hours of darkness. The quiet vigil was ending, but the relationships built and lessons learned during the night would carry forward into the next shift and the next day's challenges. The station would soon resume its busier daytime rhythm, but the night shift's contribution would remain embedded in the reports filed. The relationships maintained and the trust earned through patient, professional service during the hours when the community was most dependent on police, protection, and support. The photograph collection occupied an entire section of the basement archives. Thousands of black and white images carefully preserved in acid-free envelopes and stored in climate-controlled cabinets that protected them from the deterioration that had claimed so many other records from earlier decades. Detective Sarah Chun had discovered this visual archive during one of her late evening explorations, finding herself drawn to these frozen moments that captured not just evidence of crimes but glimpses into the daily life of the city during eras that seemed both distant and familiar. The oldest photographs dated back to the 1940s, images captured with the heavy cameras and careful lighting that had characterized police photography during that era. The pictures had a particular quality that spoke of their time, with careful composition and dramatic shadows that made even routine crime scenes appear artistic and significant. These early photographs had been taken by officers who understood that visual documentation would serve not just immediate investigative purposes, but would become historical records of how the community had dealt with crime and social disorder. One particularly striking photograph from 1947 showed the aftermath of a burglary at Morrison's hardware store, the same business that would be targeted again 4 decades later in a case that Detective Brown had investigated. The image captured the store's interior with meticulous detail, showing overturned displays and scattered merchandise arranged exactly as the investigating officers had found them. Photograph revealed details about both the crime and the era that written reports could never have conveyed. The store's inventory included items that would later become obsolete, tools and household goods that spoke of a different kind of domestic life, simpler technologies and different expectations about privacy and security. The burglary itself had been accomplished with methods that reflected the criminal techniques of that period. forced entry through a rear door using tools that suggested someone with basic mechanical knowledge rather than sophisticated criminal training. Detective Martinez, who had investigated the 1947 case, had included detailed notes with the photograph explaining the investigative techniques that had been available during that era. Fingerprinting was still a relatively new technology, and much of the investigation had relied on witness interviews and physical evidence that required careful observation and logical deduction rather than scientific analysis. The case had been solved through what Detective Martinez described as shoe leather detective work, systematic canvassing of the neighborhood to identify people who had been in the area during the time when the burglary had occurred. The breakthrough had come when several witnesses had reported seeing a man carrying a large satchel walking through the alley behind the hardware store during the early morning hours when the crime had taken place. The suspect, eventually identified as Thomas Wilson, a 23-year-old unemployed factory worker, had been arrested when the stolen tools were discovered in his rented room above a downtown boarding house. The photograph collection included an image of Wilson's room, showing the stolen merchandise arranged on a small table, along with evidence of the desperate circumstances that had motivated his crime. Wilson's room had been spare and depressing, containing only the basic necessities of someone living on the margins of economic survival. The stolen tools had represented not just immediate resale value, but the possibility of legitimate employment in construction or manufacturing, work that Wilson had been unable to secure through normal channels during the economic uncertainty that had followed the end of the war. Detective Martinez's final report on the case had included observations about the social conditions that had contributed to Wilson's criminal behavior, noting the challenges faced by returning veterans and displaced workers who were struggling to find their place in a peacetime economy. The approach had been more understanding than punitive, recognizing that effective law enforcement required attention to the underlying factors that created crime rather than simple punishment of criminal acts. The photograph of Wilson himself, taken during his booking, revealed a young man who appeared more confused and ashamed than defiant or dangerous. His expression suggested someone who had made a desperate decision rather than someone committed to a criminal lifestyle. And Detective Martinez's notes indicated that Wilson had been cooperative throughout the investigation and genuinely remorseful about his actions. The resolution of Wilson's case had been handled through what would later be called restorative justice, though the term had not yet been invented during that era. Wilson had been required to make full restitution to Morrison's Hardware and to perform community service that utilized his mechanical skills for the benefit of elderly residents who could not afford professional repairs. The photographs from the 1950s reflected the changing character of both crime and police work during that decade of economic growth and social transformation. The images were technically superior to those from the 1940s, captured with improved equipment and lighting that allowed for more detailed documentation of crime scenes and evidence. One photograph from 1953 showed the scene of a vandalism incident at Lincoln Elementary School, where someone had broken several windows and damaged classroom furniture in what appeared to be a random act of destruction. The image captured the careful way that investigating officers had preserved the scene, with numbered markers indicating the location of evidence and measuring devices showing the scale and scope of the damage. Officer Johnson, who had investigated the case, had used the photographs as part of a comprehensive documentation process that included detailed written reports and hand-drawn diagrams of the crime scene. The visual evidence had been crucial to understanding the sequence of events and identifying the methods used by the perpetrator. The vandalism had eventually been traced to a group of teenage boys who had been using the school playground after hours and had allowed their activities to escalate into property destruction. The photographs had helped Officer Johnson understand that the damage had not been planned, but had resulted from a combination of peer pressure and poor judgment during what had begun as harmless recreation. The resolution of the case had emphasized education rather than punishment, with the responsible teenagers required to participate in after-school programs that provided constructive outlets for their energy while also learning about the cost and effort required to maintain community facilities. The photographs had been used during these educational sessions to help the boys understand the impact of their actions on the school and the broader community. The photograph collection from the 1960s documented the changing social conditions that had begun to influence both crime patterns and police responses during that turbulent decade. The images reflected new challenges related to drug use, civil rights demonstrations, and generational conflicts that had required police departments to develop new approaches to maintaining order while respecting constitutional rights and community values. One particularly significant series of photographs from 1965 documented a civil rights demonstration that had taken place in the downtown area, where local activists had organized a peaceful protest against discriminatory hiring practices by city, government, and local businesses. The images showed the careful balance that police officers had maintained between ensuring public safety and protecting the Kisco demonstrators' right to peaceful assembly. Sergeant Thompson, who had been assigned to monitor the demonstration, had used photography as both a documentation tool and a means of ensuring accountability for police actions during a sensitive situation. The photographs showed officers maintaining appropriate distances from demonstrators while ensuring that traffic continued to flow and that counter-protesters did not create dangerous confrontations. The demonstration had proceeded without incident, but the photographs had served as important documentation of the police department's commitment to protecting constitutional rights even when dealing with controversial political activities. The images had been used in subsequent training sessions to help officers understand their role in protecting democracy while maintaining public order. The photograph collection also included images from criminal investigations that had required new approaches to evidence collection and analysis. A series of photographs from 1967 documented a fraud case involving forged documents that had required detailed visual analysis to identify the techniques used by the perpetrator. Detective Williams had used photography to capture minute details of the forged documents, working with handwriting experts and document analysts to identify the specific methods and materials that had been used in the fraud scheme. The photographs had been crucial to building a case that could withstand legal scrutiny and provide convincing evidence of the defendant's guilt. The fraud case had involved a sophisticated scheme to create fake identification documents for people who wanted to assume new identities for various reasons, some legitimate and others criminal. The investigation had required Detective Williams to understand both the technical aspects of document forgery and the social networks that connected forgers with their customers. The photographs had documented not just the forged documents themselves, but also the equipment and materials used in their production, providing evidence that helped prosecutors demonstrate the scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprise. The visual evidence had been particularly important because much of the fraud had involved subtle alterations that were difficult to detect without careful examination. The 1970s photographs reflected the continuing evolution of police work and the growing sophistication of both criminal activities and investigative techniques. The images from this decade showed increased use of color photography for certain types of evidence, particularly in cases involving drug crimes where accurate color reproduction was important for identifying specific substances. One series of color photographs from 1974 documented a drug laboratory that had been discovered in an abandoned warehouse, showing the equipment and chemicals that had been used to manufacture illegal substances. The images captured details that would have been impossible to convey in black and white, including the specific colors of chemical residues and the condition of equipment that provided clues about the scale and duration of the operation. Detective Rodriguez, who had investigated the drug laboratory case, had worked with chemists and other specialists to analyze the visual evidence and understand the specific processes that had been used in drug manufacturing. The photographs had been essential to building a case that demonstrated the defendant's knowledge and intent in operating the illegal laboratory. The drug case had also required Detective Rodriguez to understand the broader social context of drug use and distribution during the 1970s, when changing social attitudes and increased availability of illegal substances had created new challenges for law enforcement. The photographs had documented not just criminal activity, but also the social conditions that had made drug manufacturing and distribution profitable and relatively easy to conceal. The investigation had led to arrests and convictions, but Detective Rodriguez's reports had also included recommendations for community-based prevention programs that addressed the social factors that made drug use attractive to young people who were struggling with economic uncertainty and social displacement. The photograph collection from the 1980s showed the continued refinement of police photography as both an investigative tool and a means of documenting social history. The images from this decade had a particular clarity and detail that reflected improved camera technology and better training for officers who were responsible for crime scene documentation. One extensive series of photographs from 1983 documented a missing person case that had required careful visual analysis to reconstruct the last known activities of a woman who had disappeared from her apartment without explanation. The photographs showed her living space exactly as it had been found, with personal belongings and daily routines preserved in a way that provided clues about her state of mind and possible destinations. Detective Chun, who had investigated the missing person case, had used photography to capture details that might not have seemed immediately relevant, but could become important as the investigation progressed. The images showed the careful arrangement of personal belongings, the types of books and magazines that had been left open, and the condition of clothing and household items that suggested the woman's plans and activities during her final days at home. The missing person had eventually been located safely, living in another state where she had moved to escape an abusive relationship that she had been too frightened to report to police. The photographs had been crucial to understanding her situation and providing evidence that supported her decision to leave without notice rather than seek official protection. The case had highlighted the challenges faced by domestic violence victims who felt trapped between dangerous home situations and legal systems that they perceived as unable or unwilling to provide adequate protection. Detective Chun's investigation had led to improved procedures for handling domestic violence cases and better coordination between police departments and social service agencies. The most recent photographs in the collection, from the late 1980s and early 1990s, showed the beginning of the digital revolution that would eventually transform police photography and evidence documentation. Some images had been captured with early digital cameras that provided immediate access to visual information, but lacked the resolution and detail of traditional film photography. These transitional years had required officers to master multiple technologies while maintaining the high standards of evidence documentation that were necessary for successful prosecution of criminal cases. The photograph collection from this period showed the experimentation and adaptation that had characterized police work during a time of rapid technological change. The photographs had also begun to reflect changing crime patterns and social conditions that would characterize law enforcement in the final decades of the 20th century. Images from drug cases showed increasing sophistication in criminal organizations, while photographs from domestic violence and child abuse cases revealed growing awareness of social problems that had previously been handled as private family matters. The visual record contained in these photographs represented more than just evidence of individual crimes. It was a comprehensive documentation of how American communities had evolved over 5 decades, how social problems had changed and persisted, and how law enforcement had adapted to serve communities with increasingly complex needs and challenges. Detective Sarah Chun had spent many quiet evening hours studying these photographs, not looking for clues to current cases but seeking to understand the continuity and change that connected past and present police work. The images had taught her that effective law enforcement required not just technical skills and legal knowledge, but also historical perspective and cultural understanding that could only come from careful attention to the accumulated wisdom of previous generations of officers. The photographs lay quietly in their protective envelopes, each one a window into a moment when ordinary people had confronted extraordinary circumstances and when police officers had worked to restore order and justice to communities that depended on their skill, courage, and wisdom. The visual archive represented the collective memory of the department and the community it served, preserving moments of crisis and resolution that had shaped the character and values of both law enforcement and civilian society. In the silence of the archive, these images continued their patient vigil, holding their secrets and their wisdom for future generations of officers who would face new challenges but would draw strength and insight from the documented experiences of those who had served before them. The photographs had become part of the institutional memory that made effective policing possible, connecting each new generation of officers to the traditions and values that defined their profession at its best. The city streets held their memories. Like a patient librarian, each intersection and alleyway preserving the echoes of events that had once commanded urgent attention but now existed only as gentle impressions in the collective consciousness of the community. Detective Sarah Chun had learned to read these urban stories during her years of walking patrol routes and responding to calls, discovering that every neighborhood carried the accumulated weight of its history in the arrangement of its buildings, the flow of its traffic, and the rhythm of its daily life. Main Street stretched through the heart of downtown, lined with buildings that had witnessed decades of change, but maintained their essential character through generations of different owners and purposes. The street had served as the backdrop for countless police incidents, from minor traffic disputes to significant criminal investigations, each one leaving its own subtle mark on the physical and social landscape of the community. The Morrison Building, a 3-story brick structure at the corner of Main and Elm, had been the site of several memorable cases over the years. Built in 1952 as a combination of street-level retail spaces and upper-floor apartments, the building had housed a succession of small businesses that reflected the changing economic character of the downtown area. During the 1970s, the ground floor had been occupied by Morrison's Five and Dime, a family-owned variety store that had served as an informal community center where neighbors gathered to catch up on local news, and children spent their allowances on penny candy and small toys. The store had been the target of a shoplifting investigation in 1976 that had revealed not criminal intent, but the desperate circumstances of families struggling with economic hardship during a period of local industrial decline. Detective Williams had handled the case with characteristic sensitivity, working with store owner Mrs. Morrison to develop solutions that address the underlying causes of theft rather than simply punishing the symptoms. The investigation had led to the creation of an informal community assistance program where families in temporary need could receive basic necessities in exchange for volunteer work that benefited the entire neighborhood. The program had operated quietly for several years, helping dozens of families weather temporary crises while maintaining their dignity and connection to the community. Mrs. Morrison had become something of a neighborhood social worker, using her store as a distribution center for clothing, food, and household items donated by more prosperous residents who wanted to help their struggling neighbors. The upper floors of the Morrison Building had housed apartments that had been home to generations of working families, many of them employees of the nearby factories that had provided the economic foundation for the community during the post-war boom years. The apartments had been the scene of various domestic disputes and family crises that had required police intervention, but more often they had been the setting for quiet stories of mutual support and neighborhood cooperation. One apartment, 2B, had been the home of the Rodriguez family during the late 1980s, when their financial struggles and generational conflicts had brought them to police attention. The small two-bedroom space had witnessed the family's journey from crisis to stability, serving as the foundation for their eventual success in rebuilding their relationships and economic security. Detective Morrison had visited the apartment on several occasions, not as an investigator, but as a community resource, who had helped the family navigate the complex systems of social support and economic opportunity that were available to families willing to work toward positive change. The apartment itself had been transformed during the family's residence, evolving from a space marked by tension and conflict to one characterized by hope and mutual respect. The Rodriguez family had eventually moved to a larger home in a different neighborhood, but they had maintained connections to the Morrison building and to other families who were struggling with similar challenges. Their success story had become part of the building's history, inspiring other residents who were facing temporary difficulties and demonstrating that police intervention could be a catalyst for positive change rather than simply a response to crisis. Maple Avenue had been the setting for one of the most complex investigations in the department's recent history. A missing person case that had required officers to understand not just criminal behavior, but also the social dynamics that influenced individual decision-making during periods of personal crisis. The tree-lined residential street had appeared peaceful and stable, but beneath its surface calm lay the intricate network of relationships and circumstances that had motivated someone to disappear from their established life. The case had centered on 247 Maple Avenue, a modest single-family home where Mrs. Dorothy Klein had lived alone since her divorce in 1976. The house had been carefully maintained, with flower gardens and precise landscaping that reflected Mrs. Klein's attention to order and beauty in her daily environment. Officer Martinez had spent considerable time at the house during his investigation, not looking for dramatic clues but simply trying to understand the rhythm of Mrs. Klein's life and the subtle changes that had preceded her disappearance. The house itself had told much of the story, revealing someone who had been preparing for major change while maintaining the appearance of normal routine. The investigation had eventually led to Mrs. Klein's reunion with her ex-husband in Denver, but the house on Maple Avenue had continued to hold the memory of her careful preparations and difficult decision to leave everything familiar in pursuit of a second chance at happiness. The new owners who had purchased the house had found letters and photographs that Mrs. Klein had left behind, creating a sense of connection to someone they had never met but whose story had become part of their homes. History. The residential neighborhoods that surrounded the downtown core had been the setting for countless minor incidents that had required police attention over the years, from noise complaints and parking disputes to more serious matters involving domestic violence and property crime. Each neighborhood had developed its own character through the accumulation of these small events, creating distinct communities within the larger urban area. Cedar Street had been known throughout the department as a model of neighborhood cooperation, where residents had developed informal systems of mutual support that prevented many problems from escalating to the point where police intervention became necessary. The street's success in maintaining social order had been the result of years of patient relationship building, led by informal community leaders who understood the importance of addressing conflicts before they became crises. The success of Cedar Street had influenced police approaches throughout the city, demonstrating the value of community policing strategies that emphasized prevention and relationship building rather than simple law enforcement. Officers assigned to the area had learned to serve as facilitators and resources rather than authority figures, helping residents develop the skills and systems necessary for self-governance and mutual support. Pine Street had presented different challenges, serving as home to several immigrant families who were navigating the complex process of cultural adaptation while maintaining their traditional values and identity. The street had required officers to develop cultural competency and language skills that allowed them to serve effectively as bridges between different communities and social systems. Detective Chun had worked extensively on Pine Street, developing relationships with community leaders and cultural organizations that helped her understand the specific needs and concerns of immigrant families. Her work had led to the development of specialized programs that provided translation services, legal assistance, and educational support for families who were struggling to navigate American institutions while preserving their cultural heritage. Commercial district along Oak Avenue had been the site of numerous property crime investigations, from simple shoplifting incidents to more complex cases involving organized theft and fraud. The street's collection of small businesses had created a unique environment where owners knew each other well and cooperated extensively in maintaining security and preventing crime. The business district's success in crime prevention had been based on informal networks of communication and mutual assistance that had developed over years of shared experience. Store owners routinely shared information about suspicious activities, coordinated their security measures, and provided mutual support during investigations and legal proceedings. Detective Brown had worked closely with the Oak Avenue business community, helping them develop formal crime prevention strategies that built upon their existing informal cooperation. The partnership had resulted in significant reductions in property crime and had created a model that was later implemented in other commercial areas throughout the Keys City. The industrial area near the railroad tracks had been the setting for several major investigations involving drug trafficking, organized crime, cases that had required officers to understand not just criminal behavior but also the economic and social conditions that made illegal activities attractive to people who were struggling with legitimate employment opportunities. The abandoned warehouses and vacant lots in the industrial area had provided convenient locations for illegal activities, but they had also served as indicators of broader economic problems that were affecting the entire community. Detective Rodriguez had worked to address both the immediate criminal activities and the underlying economic conditions that created opportunities for crime. The investigations in the industrial area had led to arrests and prosecutions, but they had also resulted in community development initiatives that brought legitimate businesses and employment opportunities to an area that had been neglected for several years. The transformation of the industrial district had demonstrated the connection between economic development and crime prevention, showing how comprehensive approaches to community problems could achieve results that pure law enforcement could not accomplish alone. The park system had provided the setting for numerous incidents involving juvenile behavior, from minor vandalism and noise complaints to more serious matters involving drug use and violence. The parks had also served as important community resources where positive activities and programs could provide constructive alternatives to criminal behavior. Central Park had been the focus of a comprehensive community policing initiative that had transformed it from a location known for problems into a safe, welcoming space where families felt comfortable bringing their children for recreation and social activities. The transformation had required coordination between police, parks department staff, community organizations, and neighborhood residents who all shared a commitment to creating positive environments for young people. Officer Washington had played a key role in the Central Park Initiative, working with youth groups and community organizations to develop programs that provided constructive activities while also maintaining safety and order. His approach had emphasized engagement and relationship building rather than enforcement, helping young people understand their role in maintaining community standards, while also providing support for their positive development. The success of the Central Park project had influenced approaches to public space management throughout the city, demonstrating how collaborative efforts between law enforcement and community organizations could create safe, positive environments that served the needs of all community members. The school zones throughout the city had been the focus of ongoing traffic safety and security initiatives that had required officers to balance enforcement responsibilities with educational and community service roles. The areas around schools had become laboratories for testing community policing approaches that emphasize prevention and relationship-building. Lincoln Elementary School had been the site of numerous incidents over the years, from traffic violations and pedestrian safety concerns to more serious matters involving threats and security breaches. The school had also been the setting for positive police-community partnerships that had improved safety while building trust between law enforcement and educational institutions. Officer Martinez had served as the community liaison for Lincoln Elementary, developing programs that brought police officers into the school for positive interactions with students, rather than simply responding to problems when they occurred. The programs had included safety education, career awareness activities, and informal mentoring relationships that helped young people develop positive attitudes toward law enforcement and community service. The success of the school-based community policing programs had demonstrated the value of early intervention and relationship building in preventing juvenile crime and building community trust. The programs had been expanded to other schools throughout the city, creating a network of positive police community partnerships that strengthened the entire community's capacity for maintaining safety and order. The downtown business district had undergone significant changes over the decades, with some buildings being renovated for new purposes while others had been demolished to make way for modern development. Each change had carried with it the memory of previous uses and the stories of people who had worked, lived, and conducted their daily business in spaces that no longer existed in their original form. The old courthouse, which had been replaced by a modern facility in 1995, had been demolished, but its memory lived on in the cases that had been decided within its walls and the people whose lives had been shaped by the proceedings that had taken place there. The site now served as a small park, but longtime residents still referred to it as the Courthouse Square and gathered there for community events that honored the area's legal and civic history. The police station itself had undergone renovations and expansions that had changed its physical character, while preserving its essential function as the center of law enforcement activities for the community. The building's evolution had reflected changing approaches to police work and community service, with new facilities designed to support community policing initiatives and collaborative problem-solving efforts. The streets of the city continued their quiet preservation of memory, each intersection and building holding the accumulated weight of decades of human experience and police intervention. The urban landscape served as a living archive of resolved cases and successful community partnerships, demonstrating how law enforcement and community cooperation could create safe, stable environments where people could pursue their daily lives with confidence and security. Detective Sarah Chun had come to understand that her work was not just about solving individual cases, but about contributing to the ongoing story of community development and social cooperation that was written in the streets, buildings, and neighborhoods of the city. Each successful investigation and positive intervention became part of the urban memory, influencing future events and creating the foundation for continued community safety and prosperity. The city rested quietly under the streetlights, its stories safely preserved in the physical spaces where they had unfolded and in the collective memory of residents who had witnessed the patient work of building and maintaining community order through decades of change and challenge. The archives had reached their natural conclusion. The final filing cabinet, representing not an ending but a transformation, where active investigations had been resolved and filed away, with the satisfaction that comes from work completed and justice served. Detective Sarah Chun had arrived at the last row of cabinets, those containing the most recently closed cases, files that represented the culmination of years of patient police work and community cooperation. The final cases reflected the full evolution of policing that had taken place over the decades she had been exploring, showing how the department had learned to balance traditional law enforcement with community service, how officers had developed skills that went beyond crime fighting to encompass social work, mediation, and community development. These last files represented the mature wisdom of an institution that had grown to understand its role in the broader project of building and maintaining civilized society. Case file 941247 contained the resolution of the Morrison burglary series that had begun with teenage Tommy Morrison's desperate attempt to furnish his secret fort in the woods. The final reports in the file documented Tommy's successful completion of high school, his acceptance to community college, and his decision to pursue a career in social work inspired by the officers who had helped him redirect his life. During his brief encounter with the criminal justice system, Detective Williams had maintained informal contact with Tommy over the years, not as a supervising officer, but as a mentor who had taken personal interest in the young man's development. The file contained Tommy's graduation announcement and a letter thanking Detective Williams for seeing potential rather than simply criminal behavior in a confused teenager who had made poor decisions during a difficult period of his life. Tommy had eventually established his own youth mentoring program, working with teenagers who were facing the same kinds of family and economic pressures that had led to his own brief criminal career. His program had been remarkably successful, helping dozens of young people find constructive alternatives to the desperation and poor judgment that often led to encounters with law enforcement. The success of Tommy's mentoring program had influenced the department's approach to juvenile cases, demonstrating the long-term value of interventions that emphasized rehabilitation and personal development rather than punishment and deterrence. Tommy's story had become part of the institutional memory that guided officers in their work with young people who found themselves in conflict with the law. The file also contained documentation of the Morrison family's complete transformation, showing how the crisis that had brought them to police attention had ultimately strengthened their relationships and improved their circumstances. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison had used the experience as an opportunity to better understand their son's needs and to develop more effective communication strategies that prevented future conflicts. Case file 941156 documented the final resolution of the Rodriguez family's domestic disputes, showing how the family mediation work that had begun with Detective Morrison's intervention had evolved into a comprehensive family strengthening program that had benefited not only the Rodriguez family, but dozens of other families who were struggling with similar challenges. Asterisk. Mrs. Rodriguez had completed training as a family counselor and had begun working with the police department to provide culturally appropriate mediation services for Hispanic families who were experiencing domestic conflicts. Her personal experience with family crisis and recovery had given her unique insights into the challenges faced by families under stress and the resources necessary for successful resolution. The program that Mrs. Rodriguez had developed had become a model for community-based approaches to domestic violence prevention, showing how people who had experienced family crisis could become valuable resources for helping others navigate similar challenges. Her work had been recognized at the state level and had influenced policy development in other communities facing similar social challenges. Mr. Rodriguez had found stable employment that utilized his mechanical skills while also providing opportunities for advancement and professional development. His success had demonstrated the connection between family stability and economic opportunity, showing how addressing family conflicts could create conditions that supported individual achievement and community prosperity. The Rodriguez children had thrived in the more stable family environment, with improved academic performance and increased involvement in community activities that provided positive outlets for their energy and talents. Their success had become another example of how effective police intervention could create ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate resolution of specific conflicts. Case file 940892 contained the final documentation of Eleanor Hoffman's community organizing work on Maple Street, showing how her informal neighborhood coordination had evolved into a comprehensive community development program that had transformed not only her own street but several surrounding neighborhoods. Eleanor had been instrumental in establishing what became known as the Neighborhood Partnership Program, a collaborative effort between residents, police, and city government that addressed everything from traffic safety and property maintenance to youth programming and elderly support services. The program had created formal mechanisms for the kind of mutual assistance that had always existed informally in close-knit communities. Neighborhood Partnership Program had been so successful that it had been replicated in communities throughout the state, with Eleanor serving as a consultant who helped other neighborhoods develop their own versions of collaborative problem-solving and mutual support systems. Her work had demonstrated how effective community policing required genuine partnership between law enforcement and engaged citizens who were committed to collective responsibility for neighborhood welfare. Detective Chun had worked closely with Eleanor in developing the program, learning how police officers could serve as catalysts for community development while also maintaining their traditional law enforcement responsibilities. The partnership had taught her that preventing crime was often more effective than responding to it, and that building strong communities was the foundation of all successful police work. Asterisk. The program that also created mechanisms for addressing social problems before they escalated to the point where police intervention became necessary, reducing the department's caseload while improving overall community safety and quality of life. The success had freed up resources that could be devoted to more serious criminal investigations, while also building trust and cooperation that made all police work more effective. Case file 940734 documented the completion of the immigrant community outreach program that Detective Chun had developed while working with the Nguyen family and other recent immigrants who were struggling with cultural adaptation and integration into American society. Working with community organizations and cultural leaders, Detective Chun had helped establish a comprehensive support system that provided translation services, legal assistance, and cultural orientation for immigrant families, while also training police officers in cultural competency skills that improved their ability to serve diverse communities effectively. The Immigrant Outreach Program had been particularly successful in preventing domestic violence and child abuse by providing families with resources and support systems that addressed the stresses of cultural adaptation before they escalated into family crisis. The program had also helped immigrant families understand their rights and responsibilities under American law while respecting their cultural values and traditions. The success of the program had influenced state legislation that provided funding for similar initiatives in other communities with significant immigrant populations, demonstrating how local police innovation could create models for broader social policy development. Case File 940623 contained the documentation of the Business District Crime Prevention Program that Detective Brown had developed while working with the Oak Avenue merchants to address property, crime, and security concerns. The program had evolved into a comprehensive small business support system that provided not only security assistance, but also business development resources, marketing cooperation, and advocacy for small business interests in local government decision-making. The program had helped revitalize the downtown business district while also reducing crime and improving public safety. The Business District program had demonstrated how crime prevention and economic development were interconnected, showing how thriving commercial areas created natural surveillance and community investment that discouraged criminal activity while providing employment opportunities and community resources that address some of the underlying causes of crime. Detective Brown had worked with business owners to develop security protocols and crime reporting systems that improved police response while also helping businesses understand their role in maintaining community safety. The collaboration had created a model of public-private partnership that had been replicated in other commercial areas throughout the city. The program had also included youth employment initiatives that provided job training and work experience for teenagers who might otherwise have been at risk for involvement in criminal activity. The program had been particularly successful in creating pathways to legitimate employment for young people who were struggling with economic disadvantage and limited opportunities. Case File 940445 documented the completion of the Central Park Revitalization Project that Officer Washington had led, showing how the transformation of a problem location into a community asset had required sustained effort and collaboration between multiple agencies and community organizations. The park project had become a national model for community policing and public space management, demonstrating how law enforcement agencies could work with parks departments, schools, community organizations, and neighborhood residents to create safe, welcoming environments that served the needs of all community members. Officer Washington had been promoted to sergeant and had been assigned to lead the department's Community Development Division, where he worked on similar projects throughout the city. His success with the park project had influenced his assignment to develop comprehensive approaches to public safety that emphasized prevention and community building rather than reactive law enforcement. The park had become a center for community activities and programs that brought together people from different neighborhoods and backgrounds, creating social connections that strengthened the entire community's capacity for mutual support and collective problem solving. The final case files represented more than just the conclusion of individual investigations. They documented the transformation of policing itself, showing how a law enforcement agency had evolved from a reactive crime-fighting organization into a proactive community development institution that addressed the underlying causes of social problems while maintaining its traditional public safety responsibilities. The archives had become a comprehensive record of this transformation, preserving not only the documentation of individual cases, but also the institutional memory of how effective policing had evolved through decades of experimentation, learning, and adaptation to changing community needs and social conditions. Detective Sarah Chun closed the last file and returned it to its proper place in the filing system, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction at the completeness and order that characterized the archives. Every case had been resolved, every investigation concluded. Every story brought to its appropriate ending through the patient work of officers who had understood their role in the larger project of building and maintaining civilized community life. The basement archives held the accumulated wisdom of decades of police work, demonstrating how individual acts of professional competence and human compassion had combined to create a comprehensive system of community safety and social support. The files represented not just law enforcement, but the broader human project of learning to live together peacefully despite differences in background, circumstances, and individual challenges. The silence in the archives was profound but not empty. It was filled with the satisfaction of work completed, problems solved, and communities strengthened through the accumulated efforts of many people working toward common goals of safety, justice, and mutual support. The final filing cabinet stood closed, its contents safely preserved for future generations who would face new challenges, but could draw wisdom and inspiration from the documented experiences of those who had served before them. The archives had become a monument to the possibility of human cooperation and the effectiveness of institutions dedicated to serving the common good. In the quiet basement, the fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune, casting their steady glow over row after row of carefully organized files that held the stories of a community's journey towards safety, justice, and prosperity. The archives rested in perfect order, each file in its proper place, each story complete, each case closed with the satisfaction that comes from work well done and service faithfully rendered. The city above continued its restless movement, but down in the archives, everything had found its place. The stories slept peacefully in their manila folders. The photographs rested quietly in their protective envelopes, and the institutional memory of decades of community service waited patiently for the next generation of officers who would add their own stories to the comprehensive record of human cooperation and professional dedication. Detective Sarah Chun switched off the desk lamp and walked slowly through the corridors of filing cabinets, her footsteps echoing softly in the peaceful silence. She carried with her the knowledge and wisdom contained in thousands of files. The understanding that effective police work was really about understanding people and helping them find ways to live together peacefully. The elevator carried her back to the main floor of the station, where the night shift continued its quiet vigil over the city's safety. But she carried with her the profound peace that comes from knowing that the work of many years had been completed successfully, that the stories of conflict and resolution had been carefully preserved, and that the accumulated wisdom of the past would guide future efforts to build and maintain the kind of community where all people could thrive. The archives would rest through the night and through all the nights to come, holding their secrets and their wisdom in perfect order, ready to share their lessons with anyone who took the time to listen to the quiet voices of experience and dedication that spoke from every carefully preserved file. In the silence of the basement, the work was done, the stories were complete, and the peace of resolution settled over everything like a gentle blanket of snow, covering all the complexities of human experience with the simple beauty of order restored and justice served. The final case had been filed, the last story told, and the archive rested in perfect completion, holding the memory of a community's journey towards safety and peace, preserving the wisdom of those who had served faithfully in the cause of human dignity and social order. In the quiet darkness, the files slept peacefully, their work complete, their stories told, their lessons preserved for all who would come after, seeking to understand how people could live together in harmony, despite all the challenges that tested the bonds of community and the strength of human cooperation. The silence was complete, the peace profound, the work finished with the satisfaction that comes only from service faithfully rendered, and duty honorably performed in the cause of justice and the common good. Crime Stories for Sleep, Volume 10 Hook, Beyond the Last Filing Cabinet. A new door opened to reveal rooms that time had forgotten, where older stories waited in deeper silence than any archive had ever known. Introduction. Welcome to an unexpected continuation of crime. Stories for sleep. Tonight we discover that some stories rest even deeper than the archives we thought we knew completely. In the forgotten corners of the building, older mysteries sleep in perfect stillness, waiting to share their gentle wisdom. Let these ancient whispers guide you toward the deepest rest. Detective Sarah Chun had believed she had explored every corner of the basement archives. But on this particular evening, as she made her way through the familiar corridors of filing cabinets, she noticed something that had somehow escaped her attention during all her previous visits. Behind the final row of cabinets, partially concealed by shadows and the particular angle of the overhead lighting, was a door she had never seen before. The door was older than the rest of the basement's features, constructed of heavy wood that had darkened with age and fitted with brass hardware that spoke of an earlier era of institutional construction. A small placard, barely visible in the dim light, bore the simple inscription, "Historical Records, prior to 1940. The door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting discovery by someone patient, enough to look beyond the obvious boundaries of the known archive. Sarah pushed the door open gently, and it moved with the silent smoothness of hinges that had been recently maintained despite their obvious age. Beyond the threshold lay a room that seemed to exist outside of time, where the very air held the accumulated stillness of decades, undisturbed by the hurried pace of modern police work. The historical records room was larger than she had expected, extending far beyond what the building's exterior dimensions had suggested was possible. Row upon row of wooden filing cabinets lined the walls, their surfaces polished to a deep patina that reflected the soft light from a series of old-fashioned desk lamps positioned throughout the space. The cabinets were of a different design than those in the main archives, constructed with the careful craftsmanship that had characterized institutional furniture from the early decades of the 20th century. The room's atmosphere was profoundly peaceful, marked by a quality of silence that went beyond mere absence of sound to suggest the deep rest that comes to places where important work has been completed and carefully preserved. The air itself seemed to move more slowly here, as if the passage of time had been modified by the weight of accumulated history and the reverence due to stories that had found their final resting place. Sarah approached the nearest filing cabinet and opened the top drawer, revealing files that had been organized with the same meticulous care that characterized the more recent archives, but using systems and materials that spoke of an earlier era of documentation. The manila folders were thicker and more substantial than modern versions, constructed of paper that had been manufactured to last for generations rather than merely years. The first file she examined was labeled Case 230156, April 1923, and contained the investigation records for a missing person case that had been handled by Detective Michael O'Connor, whose careful handwriting filled page after page of detailed observations and methodical investigative steps. The case had involved the disappearance of Mrs. Catherine Murphy, a widow who had vanished from her boarding house room without explanation or apparent cause. Detective O'Connor's investigation had proceeded with the same patient thoroughness that would characterize police work throughout the following decades, but using the methods and resources available during the 1920s. His reports described hours of careful observation, systematic interviews with neighbors and acquaintances, and logical deduction based on physical evidence that had been examined without the benefit of modern forensic techniques. The case had been solved through what Detective O'Connor described as persistent attention to detail and genuine concern for Mrs. Murphy's welfare. She had been discovered living quietly in a nearby town, where she had moved to escape the unwanted romantic attention of a boarding house resident who had been making her life uncomfortable but had not engaged in behavior that would have constituted criminal activity under the laws of that period. Mrs. Murphy's situation had been resolved through conversation and mediation rather than formal legal action, with Detective O'Connor serving as an intermediary who helped all parties understand the misunderstandings that had created the problem. The resolution had allowed Mrs. Murphy to return to her previous living situation with assurances that her privacy and independence would be respected. The file contained a letter from Mrs. Murphy, written several months after the case was closed, thanking Detective O'Connor for his kindness and discretion in handling a delicate situation that could have been embarrassing if approached with less sensitivity. Her letter spoke of the relief she had felt at being treated with dignity and respect during a period when she had felt vulnerable and uncertain about her options. Sarah found herself struck by the similarities between Detective O'Connor's approach and the methods used by officers she had known throughout her own career. The fundamental principles of patient investigation, community service, and genuine concern for human welfare had remained constant across the decades, even as the specific techniques and technologies had evolved dramatically. The next file dealt with a property crime investigation from 1925, where Detective James Patterson had investigated a series of burglaries that had affected several businesses in the downtown commercial district. The stolen items had been small and valuable, suggesting someone who understood both the practical challenges of theft and the economics of disposing of stolen merchandise. Detective Patterson's investigation had relied heavily on personal relationships and community knowledge, working with business owners and residents who served as informal sources of information about unusual activities and suspicious behavior in their neighborhoods. The approach had required considerable time and patience, but had eventually led to the identification of a young man who had been stealing items to support a gambling habit that had developed beyond his ability to control. The resolution of the case had emphasized rehabilitation rather than punishment, with Detective Patterson working with the young man's family and community leaders to develop a support system that addressed his gambling problem while also ensuring that he made appropriate restitution to the businesses he had victimized. The file contained documentation of the young man's successful recovery and his eventual establishment of a legitimate business that employed several other people who had struggled with similar challenges. Detective Patterson had maintained informal contact with him for several years, serving as a mentor and resource who helped him navigate the complexities of rebuilding his reputation and relationships within the community. These cases from the 1920s revealed policing approaches that had emphasized personal relationships and community integration rather than the more formal and bureaucratic methods that would develop during later decades. Officers during this earlier period had served multiple roles within their communities, functioning as informal social workers, mediators, counselors, and community organizers in addition to their traditional law enforcement responsibilities. Sarah continued through the files, discovering case after case that demonstrated the timeless principles of effective police work while revealing the specific challenges and opportunities that had characterized law enforcement during different historical periods. A domestic violence case from 1927 had been handled with remarkable sensitivity for its era, with Detective Mary Sullivan working with women's organizations and religious leaders to provide support and protection for a woman whose husband had been threatening violence. Detective Sullivan had been one of the first women to Sullivan's serve as a police detective in the city, and her files revealed the particular challenges she had faced in establishing credibility and authority within a male-dominated profession while also developing innovative approaches to cases that involved women and children who were experiencing various forms of victimization. Her work had been groundbreaking in its recognition that effective police response to domestic violence required understanding the complex social and economic factors that trapped women in dangerous relationships and prevented them from seeking help through traditional channels. Detective Sullivan had developed networks of community resources that provided practical assistance and emotional support for women who were struggling to escape abusive situations. Asterisk. The success of Detective Sullivan's approach had influenced police policies and procedures for decades, establishing precedents for victim advocacy and community collaboration that would be formally adopted by later generations of officers who built upon her innovative work. A fraud investigation from 1929 had required Detective Robert Chun, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, to understand complex financial schemes that had been designed to take advantage of people's limited knowledge about banking and investment practices during the period leading up to the economic collapse that would soon devastate the community. Detective Chun's investigation had revealed a sophisticated scheme involving false investment opportunities that had targeted elderly residents who were seeking safe ways to preserve their savings during a period of economic uncertainty. The perpetrator had been someone with legitimate business credentials who had used his reputation and community connections to gain the trust of victims before defrauding them of their life savings. The investigation had required Detective Chun to master complex financial concepts while also understanding the social dynamics that had made elderly residents vulnerable to exploitation. His work had led not only to the arrest and prosecution of the perpetrator, but also to the development of consumer education programs that helped community members recognize and avoid financial fraud. The case had been particularly significant because it had occurred just months before the stock market crash that would create widespread economic hardship throughout the community. Detective Chun's investigation had helped several families recover their stolen savings, providing them with resources that proved crucial during the difficult years that followed. The files from the 1930s reflected the particular challenges that had faced law enforcement during the economic depression, when traditional crime patterns had been complicated by widespread unemployment, family displacement, and social disruption that had created new forms of criminal activity while also requiring police to serve expanded social service roles within their communities. A case from 1932 had involved Detective William Morrison investigating what appeared to be a simple theft but had revealed a complex network of mutual assistance that had developed among families who were struggling to survive during the worst years of the economic crisis. The theft had actually been part of an informal sharing system where families pooled resources and took turns providing for each other's basic needs. Detective Morrison's investigation had required him to understand not just the specific incident that had prompted the complaint, but also the broader social context that had created alternative economic relationships among people who were finding that traditional employment and commercial systems were no longer adequate to meet their survival needs. The resolution had involved working with community leaders and social service organizations to formalize some of the mutual assistance networks that had developed spontaneously, creating systems that provided support for struggling families while also maintaining respect for property, rights, and legal standards. The case had demonstrated how effective police work during crisis periods required flexibility and creativity in balancing law enforcement responsibilities with community service roles that addressed the underlying social conditions that created apparent criminal activity. A missing child case from 1934 had required Detective Anna Kowalski to coordinate with multiple agencies and community organizations, while also managing the intense emotional pressure that accompanied investigations involving children's safety and welfare. The case had been resolved successfully, but had required innovative approaches to community mobilization and resource coordination that would influence police procedures for decades. The child had been found safe after a community-wide search that had involved hundreds of volunteers working under police coordination to systematically examine every possible location where a lost child might seek shelter or become trapped. The search had been successful not only because of its scope and organization, but also because of the community relationships that Detective Kowalski had built during her years of service. The case had led to the development of formal protocols for missing child investigations that emphasized rapid community mobilization and systematic search procedures, while also providing emotional support for families who were experiencing the trauma of having a missing child. These historical cases revealed patterns that had remained constant throughout the decades of police work that Sarah had been studying in the main archives. Effective law enforcement had always required officers who understood their communities deeply, who could balance multiple roles and responsibilities, and who approached their work with genuine concern for human welfare rather than simple enforcement of legal standards. The room seemed to extend indefinitely into the shadows, with more filing cabinets visible in the distance and the suggestion of additional rooms or sections that contained even older records from the earliest years of organized policing in the community. The historical records represented not just documentation of individual cases, but a comprehensive record of how law enforcement had evolved in response to changing social conditions and community needs. Sarah realized that she could spend years exploring these historical records, learning from the experiences of officers who had faced different challenges but had been guided by the same fundamental commitments to community service and human dignity that characterized the best police work of any era. The silence in the historical records room was profound but welcoming, filled with the accumulated wisdom of generations of officers who had learned through experience how to serve their communities effectively while maintaining the highest standards of professional competence and personal integrity. As she prepared to leave the historical records room, Sarah felt a deep sense of connection to the long tradition of police service that had shaped her own career and would continue to guide future generations of officers who would face new challenges but could draw strength and wisdom from the documented experiences of those who had served before them. The historical records would remain in their peaceful rest, preserving the memory of officers and cases that had contributed to the ongoing development of effective, community-oriented policing that served not just law and order, but human flourishing and social justice. The door closed silently behind her, but the wisdom contained in the historical records remained accessible to anyone who took the time to look beyond the obvious boundaries of the present moment and discover the deeper currents of experience and knowledge that connected past and present in the ongoing work of building and maintaining safe, just, and peaceful communities. In the deepest silence of the archives, where time moved differently and stories rested in perfect preservation, the work of many generations continued its patient vigil, holding its secrets and its wisdom ready for those who would come seeking to understand how communities could be built and maintained through the steady application of professional skill guided by genuine care for human welfare and the common good.